Good morning, everybody. We'll now begin with the presentation of Rogers Communications Canada, Inc. Please introduce yourself and your colleagues, and you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you. Mr. Chairperson and Commissioners, my name is David Watt, and I am Rogers Senior Vice President Regulatory. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel. To my right is Joe Natale, President and CEO of Rogers Communications. To Joe's right is Brent Johnston, President of Wireless. To Brent's right is Howard Slaughter, Vice President, Regulatory Telecom. To Howard's right is Richard Feasy. Mr. Feasy has 30 years of experience in regulatory matters across 20 markets in Europe, Asia, the Americas. He was the director of Vodafone, then the largest wireless carrier, for 10 years. Currently, Mr. Feasy is a member of the UK Competition Authority, the Competition and Markets Authority, and he wrote our piece on the international experience. To my left is George Fernandez, Chief Technology Officer. To George's left is Pam Dinsmore, Vice President, Regulatory Cable and Broadband. And to Pam's left is Dan Gilbert, Director, Wholesale. Behind me is Suzanne Blackwell, President of Giganomics. Suzanne authored our expert piece on sunset clauses and is well known to the Commission. And beside Suzanne is Jeff Hunter, President of Amobex. Jeff is a telecom expert with 20 years experience in startups, deployment, operations of telecom companies, experience in roaming, MVNOs, and wholesale matters, and he authored our piece on cost structures for MVNOs and that experience. With that, I will turn it over to Joe.
Thank you, David, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. This proceeding is absolutely critical to the future of our industry, Canada's global leadership in the digital economy, and ultimately the prosperity of Canadians. We've been listening intently for the past week. We have found the discussion informative, but also discouraging. Clearly, there's a wide awareness gap. Rogers and our industry as a whole have failed to communicate to Canadians that Canada is a global leader and enjoys world-class network experience based on coverage and quality, and that we have an intensely competitive wireless market that continues to deliver more affordability and value for Canadians. I implore you to keep reminding yourselves of the importance of what is at stake here. This is about nation building. This is about the future of wireless investment and Canada's ability to leverage it for the promise of 5G and for all Canadians. Like the railroad a century ago, it's vitally important we get this right. We've built a great industry where Canada dominates when it comes to coverage and quality, reaching 99% of Canadians with wireless speeds, second only to South Korea. Rogers brings a unique perspective to these discussions that is founded in our entrepreneurial history. Ted Rogers was a great Canadian entrepreneur who was a builder and a visionary. In 1960, he borrowed $85,000 to buy one FM radio station when less than 3% of Canadians had FM radios. He was one of the first to introduce cable TV to Canadians. Today, that network reaches 4.5 million homes and businesses. He was the first to bring wireless to Canada in 1985, 35 years ago this Canada Day. If you'll indulge me, let's take a moment and reflect on that moment in our history.
I'm Dawn Ritchie for Rogers Cable TV, and I'm down here amongst much of the Canada Day hoopla for the official launch of the Cantel cellular telephone, something that's about to revolutionize our telecommunications system. It's a portable telephone. It is so portable, in fact, that you'll be able to install it in your car or even carry it over your shoulder.
The first phone call officially from Toronto to Montreal over the Cantel network. Anybody home? Hello? Monsieur Glapeau, speaking. Comment ça va? Ça va bien. Your voice sounds so clear. It sounds like it's a good beginning.
It's working very well, and I hope. I wonder what will be left for the next generation to discover or experience.
First of all, I'd like to say
that it's a great day for Canada to have this new high-tech industry start and be pioneered by Canadians. We have in our company Canadians from across Canada. We have Sam Belsberg and Mark from Vancouver, Philippe de Gaspé-Beaubien from the province of Quebec, our group, Rogers Cable and Broadcasting Group from Ontario, and Ameritech from the United States. It's a great partnership, and we're delighted you're with us today. And now for the official opening.
Today, we're on the very next important doorstep, 5G. When you look back at FM radio, cable TV, and the dawn of wireless, they all have common themes. They all required an appetite for great risk and massive capital investments. And the returns have not always been self-evident from the onset. 5G is no different. Making Canada a global leader in these areas was only possible because of two critical factors: the ability to take a long-term view of investment and a regulatory environment that facilitated and supported investment and allowed a long-term perspective. Some people have appeared before you presenting what we think are misperceptions and mischaracterizations. Your decisions must be based on facts. You have the evidence and you have the expertise. Evidence-based decision-making may not sound flashy, but it's what delivers sound public policy and thoughtful regulation. Looking back at the last 35 years of wireless, and more specifically the last 5 years, I would ask you to reflect on 5 important principles. These are as valid today as they were when you held your last wireless review. Principle number 1, it is critical that regulatory policy continue to take a long-term view. When we look to 5G and beyond, it's clear the wireless industry in Canada has not fully matured and still needs careful nourishing. The 5G road ahead requires another generational investment, not unlike the road from 1 to 4G. For the first 25 years of wireless, Rogers did not make a single cent of return on our $15 billion investment in network and spectrum during that period. Since February 2014, only 6 years ago, we've invested $12 billion in our networks for equipment and spectrum, and we borrowed much of that money. Our debt has gone up by $6 billion. We now sit with more debt than ever in our company's history, over $18 billion, and we're not alone. Our Canadian competitors all sit with debt leverage ratios that are at or near their maximum. Principle number 2, competition is alive and well in Canada. I cannot overemphasize how competitive the market is. We have 2 sources of customers: new wireless customers and switching subscribers. Both categories of customers are extremely price sensitive. Look at churn. Every year since 2015, 5 to 6 million customers have switched providers. In 2019 alone, 6 million customers switched, over 17% of the Canadian market. The 4th carrier policy is working. In the past 5 years, Videotron has almost doubled its subscribers to 1.3 million. Freedom has done the same, growing to 1.7 million customers on an LTE network that now extends to most Canadian CMAs and is being extended to smaller communities. Last year, Freedom and Videotron accounted for 33% of net new customer additions. This is not a market crying out for mandated MVNOs. I get up every morning knowing there are at least 3 formidable competitors and 7 or 8 brands in every market trying to eat our lunch. Simply put, wireless competition in Canada has never been this intense. Since you took your preliminary review, there have been dramatic changes in consumer offers and significant competitor successes in the wireless market. The events of the last year cannot be dismissed as inconsequential or unimportant. I listened carefully to what regional carriers told the Commission over the last 6 days of the hearing. Why would you jeopardize Canada's regional carriers now? Principle number 3, our ability to drive affordability and a customer-first agenda is critical. This intense competition is expanding, and the range of affordable options available to Canadians is also expanding. Overall, the price per gigabyte of data is down 50% since 2015. In contrast, since 2015, the CPI has increased almost 10%. We're seeing massive increases in data consumption. As data usage climbs, prices per gigabyte are coming down dramatically. This shift is significant. If you drive an extra 200 kilometers a week to get to a new job, you'll spend more money on gas. If your hydro use goes up by 50%, your hydro bill is going up by 50%. That's not what Canadians are seeing with their wireless bills. The price of data is going down as usage goes up. Since joining Rogers almost 3 years ago, my #1 priority has been putting customers first. This means driving affordability and customer service for Canadians while continuing to invest in our wireless network. We are meeting the accelerating demand for data and providing leading-edge wireless technologies across our vast country. We launched unlimited plans. Rogers kick-started the introduction of unlimited data plans in Canada with Rogers Infinite, a development that has dramatically changed the marketplace. These plans are not just radically cheaper than previous plans, they eliminate overage costs and provide peace of mind. Let me be clear, regulatory considerations had nothing to do with our decision. Those who suggest otherwise are spectacularly ill-informed about our business and what drives it. Our introduction of Rogers Infinite was solely motivated by the competitive need to address the customer pain point with overage charges and to increase data affordability and consumption. We've seen an immense material improvement in customer satisfaction scores and massive adoption of these plans. The launch of Infinite was a crucial step to make Rogers 5G ready in advance of how Canadians will use wireless services in the future. We expanded lower-priced options. The range of lower-cost plans in the marketplace has expanded, as has the service included in those plans. Your own list, distributed at the first day of this hearing, demonstrates the range and scope of these plans, as low as $15. Consumers can choose from a number of data-only plans, the one gap previously identified and addressed by the Commission in Canadian wireless markets. If pricing is a central issue, then surely we must consider up-to-date data and rely on sound methodology. Some presenters have relied on dated price comparisons. Our rates are comparable to the U.S. A Verizon Starter Unlimited plan costs slightly over $90 Canadian versus $75 for Rogers Infinite. Introducing a wider range of plans at lower prices means more Canadians are now connected. In the last 5 years, Canada has added 5 million more wireless customers, increasing the penetration rate by 10%. And 81% of the Canadian population has a smartphone. This is virtually everyone in the country over the age of 10. These phones have been made available to Canadians with substantial upfront subsidies by Canadian wireless carriers. And it's important that consumer sentiment on wireless pricing not get confused with the exploding cost of smartphones. The iPhone was introduced in 2007 and was sold for $700. A high-end iPhone today costs close to $2,000. Principle number 4, the industry must earn a reasonable return on investments to keep technology investments rolling out to all Canadians. I've heard various participants in this hearing quoting EBITDA margins or various other metrics as some indication of heightened profitability. I think it's important to understand and respect that return on assets is the only true indicator of profitability, especially in a capital-intensive business. A partial accounting measure, such as EBITDA, that excludes key costs like capital expenditures, spectrum purchases, interest, income taxes, is not a measure of profitability. It excludes up to 50% of our expenditures. It is not economic profit. Over the last 5 years, our return on assets was 5.1%. Over the same period, the Canada Pension Plan returned 10.1%. And this is despite heightened costs relative to other countries across the globe. Specifically, We have a population density that's 1/10 the size of the US, with a geographic area that is the second largest in the world. Tough economics for an industry where coverage matters. We pay up to 7 times the amount paid for spectrum in other countries. That's a fact. We pay a vast portion of our cost in US dollars, from handsets to network equipment, and that is a 35% currency premium. And we pay more in taxes and fees to our government than the US industry does. Despite these heightened costs, and prices for our customers are comparable to US levels. Principle number 5, network quality and capability really matters to our future. We were one of the first countries in the world to launch 4G, and now we cover 99% of Canadians with LTE, and we continuously expand capacity to address demand for data. And data growth is going up by 30% per year. Today, our 4G networks are twice as fast as US networks on average. Make no mistake, this is a massive and profound achievement, given the cost to serve a country the size of Canada with our challenging topography and low population density. It will come as no surprise to the panel that we subsidize our wireless operations outside of the major cities in our country. We do this because it's right for Canada, and universal access is a good thing for Canadians. We've been able to do this in smaller cities and rural communities because we've had a regulatory environment that supports infrastructure investment. MVNOs do not bridge the digital divide. They do not bring new services to underserved communities. They do not bring more rural coverage to Canadians. We began the launch of 5G this January. 5G will require a massive investment over the next 5 years and beyond. It will be one of the most significant civil engineering projects in generations. These 5 principles have served Canadian consumers well. We cannot square the success of these principles with any need to mandate MVNOs. Richard.
Good morning. I was asked by Rogers to consider the evidence from the rest of the world, and you have a copy of my report. In my view, that evidence leads to 3 key conclusions. First, very few regulators around the world have ever implemented mandatory MVNO access regulation, and the international trend over the past 15 years is for less, not more. Canada would be an international outlier if you were to impose MVNO regulation. There's been no new mandated wholesale regulation in the European Union since 2006. In the 2 markets where it was applied, it's since been withdrawn. The latest changes to the European regulatory framework are intended to make this kind of regulation less likely in future, and that reflects the realization that MVNO regulation has been ineffective and that it's undermined the incentives to invest in the new mobile networks and technologies which deliver real benefits to consumers. The United States has never mandated MVNO access, nor has Australia nor New Zealand. There's only one relevant case for your purposes today, and that's in Norway, which has 2 facilities-based carriers, one with a 60% wholesale market share, of which is regulated. European competition authorities thought for a few years ago that mandated MVNOs might restore the competition lost in mergers between wireless carriers, but they've abandoned that remedy in recent cases once it became clear that it was ineffective. Second, the evidence suggests that the promises that are made by MVNOs in proceedings like this and elsewhere in the world as to their market impact are rarely kept in practice. I've seen no credible evidence that having more MVNOs in a wireless market or mandating access for those MVNOs leads to lower prices, either for consumers in general or for those on low incomes. Third, there's been little research on the impact of mandated MVNOs on wireless investment because there have been so few cases to study. What there is suggests it's negative, but more importantly, there's now strong evidence that wholesale regulation with mandated rates in the wireline market has had a significant impact, adverse impact, on wireline investment. And in my view, there's no reason to think that wholesale regulation in wireless markets would not have the same significant adverse impact on wireless investment, including in 5G. George.
Unprecedented new investment in Canadian wireless networks is required. In the notice of consultation, the Commission has posited that given the extensive investments that made in recent years, the benefits that a well-developed MVNO market would deliver to Canadians are now more likely to outweigh any negative impacts. That is wrong. In fact, the opposite is true. While Rogers already spends $1.3 billion in capital each year just to maintain capacity, while data usage grows 30% a year, Rogers and the entire wireless industry are now also poised to make the most extensive telecommunication investments ever. 1 month ago, Rogers started to light up the first 5G network in Canada. This is a proud accomplishment for Rogers and indeed all of Canada. It is crucial that we keep pace with the rest of the world. However, while it took a considerable amount of time, capital and effort to launch 5G, this was just a small fraction of what needs to come. Why is 5G so important? Because without it, Canada's digital economy can't move to the next frontier. 5G will enable new applications for business in every sector of the economy and make faster and more innovative services available to consumers. Through a combination of ultra-low latency and high bandwidth connectivity, a combination of 5G networks will enable applications such as autonomous mining, autonomous driving, and smart communities. These advances are not just important to the wireless industry, they will be the backbone of the Canadian digital economy. We know that over time, investment in new technology helps drive down prices to customers. We will see a lower unit cost enabled by these investments. But to get there, 5G and the Canadian digital economy hinge on massive investments being made by wireless carriers. As you have heard before, but it bears repeating, it is estimated that between 2020 and 2026, approximately $26 billion in incremental investment by Canadian wireless carriers will be carried out to deliver 5G. People often equate wireless investment with sophisticated equipment. In fact, 70% of our 5G investment costs are related to bricks and mortar, physical infrastructure we need built. This translates into well-paying jobs in communities right across our country as we work with dozens of construction suppliers to build our networks. This includes small, regionally based businesses and large companies like Leadcore and Telecom. These firms build access roads to cell sites, they build towers, they install small cells. Canadian carriers will shoulder the investment burden for Canada to compete. However, this will only happen if they have the financial ability to make the massive necessary investments. If this money is not available from our operations, the investment level will be lower and the 5G rollout will not be as extensive as it would otherwise be. The single biggest impact will be on rural areas outside of the major centres, as they are the most costly to build and maintain and generate less revenue. Yet, these are the very areas that both the Government of Canada and the CRTC have identified as key targets for their broadband policies. Pam.
Instead of inhibiting investment, the CRTC should be taking this opportunity to enable it. There are several measures that the Commission can take that will assist carriers to deploy new technologies and expand their footprints into unserved areas. It's no exaggeration that hundreds of thousands of 5G small cells will need to be deployed. Traditional telephone and hydro company poles are ideal supporting structures, as is street furniture such as streetlights, bus shelters and signs, and public buildings. Timely, cost-effective, non-discriminatory access to this passive infrastructure is critical. Higher access costs translate to higher prices for consumers, and delay means slower rollout to consumers, and Canada falls behind. We recognize the current limitations on the Commission's jurisdiction to address access to provincially regulated utility poles. However, we believe the Commission can take steps to clarify the rules regarding carrier access to municipal infrastructure and ILEC support structures within the existing Canadian legal framework. The Commission should clarify now that its jurisdiction under the Telecommunications Act extends to wireless equipment, as well as to municipal street furniture and buildings. In doing so, the Commission must clarify that the rules established in the LEDCOR decision for wireline deployment apply to wireless equipment, including the core principles of no occupancy fees and reimbursement for municipal work-related relocation of our equipment. This would address a key 5G issue. That is, the annual fees municipalities seek to charge for the placement of small cell antennas on municipal infrastructure. The Commission should also convene a proceeding to review and amend the ILEC support structure tariffs to address transparency on available capacity and future use, and the fees and timelines to access available capacity. Finally, the Commission should confirm that small cell antennas are captured by the existing approved ILEC tariffs. Joe?
In conclusion, let me circle back to where I began. What's most important is doing the right thing for Canada and Canadians long term. We have a massive appetite for investment. We want to continue on our path of excellence in nation building, especially on the doorstep of 5G. But we can only make those bets when we have regulatory certainty and support in our future. Without a recognition of that investment potential and an appropriate regulatory framework, our collective costs of capital increase materially, and the investments that are required are jeopardized. You have my commitment and the commitment of Rogers to work together and strike the right balance between driving affordability and fueling investment for the future. It is that regulatory mindset that allowed Ted to be a great Canadian entrepreneur. It is that mindset that has created a leading global telecommunications industry. And more than ever, global leadership is critical for Canada. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. We'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Natali and your colleagues. You have indeed, it would appear from your opening remarks, been paying attention to our proceeding, and you've touched on, not surprisingly, a number of the areas that we've been discussing with interveners. I guess the good news is that you've had a chance to listen and prepare yourself. The bad news is we have lots of statements and evidence to put before you to ask you to speak to. It won't surprise you, the outline of what I want to talk to you about today. I think I have a couple of questions about market power and associated definitions. We'll talk a little about retail market issues, then not surprisingly wholesale market issues, and finish off with a few questions about the future of the mobile wireless industry. So that's our menu for this morning. Perhaps I'll begin just with a very broad question about market definition. Back in May, in Rogers' intervention, pardon me, I'm not getting choked up by your participation. Struggling with a little bit of a cold. You submitted that the geographic market is provincial, and you submitted a document, figure one, of your intervention, had a summary that looked at province by province geographic market definitions. And in that one, for example, there were 6 competitors in Northern Ontario, 4 in Manitoba. Now, I don't want to minimize or dispute the fact that companies like ExploreNet or T-Baytel and Eastlink are not providing service in Manitoba or Northern Ontario, but certainly they're not on the same footing or basis as the 3 national players. So all that to ask you, do you continue to hold the view that using province as the relevant geographic market is appropriate? And I guess I'd ask you to elaborate on, do you think it hides some particular market characteristics or peculiarities that might be better addressed if we took a smaller market definition such as that proposed by the Competition Bureau?
Yes, we would modify our position in light of the substantial evidence and material put on the record over the last 8 months. We thought we put forward our position provincially. Typically, it has been provincial pricing, etc. However, we agree with other parties that a smaller geographic market would be more appropriate given the nature of competition that exists today and the ability for people to switch carriers. So we would, I think the 2 options that would be most discussed is at the CMA level, which actually causes me to wonder, that really doesn't define the areas outside the CMA area. I think that is being picked up by people who have suggested a Tier 4 categorization. That comes, as you know, from ISED spectrum categorization of geographic territories. I think that likely, well, we would view that as more appropriate than our original provincial position. We have, to say we've learned and improved our position.
Thank you for that. Do you see, you may have heard me ask the representatives from the Competition Bureau whether or not they saw any particular challenges in going forward with a sort of 2-pronged approach of looking at provinces and potentially some kind of collection of CMAs. Any views on that particular challenge?
I guess what you're looking at there is saying, is there a province that is where competition is widespread throughout the entire province, such that that province could be treated as a geographic market? I think we would still think that the better approach would be the smaller Tier 4 approach.
Okay, thank you. Moving a little to pricing, generally speaking, in your submissions, you've certainly made reference to declining mobile services rates. And again, this morning, Mr. Natali, in your opening remarks, you've touched on it. But what would you say price declines in Canada, or let me rephrase that, how do recent price declines in Canada compare to price declines internationally? You've no doubt heard the discussions that say, yes, but they're going down everywhere, which is generally true, but I'd just like to give you an opportunity to speak to that particular point as it's been raised by several interveners.
Sure. I'll start. Maybe then I'll ask Brent to chime in as well. As we find ways to improve the efficiency of our business, as we find ways of adding capacity at better unit costs, we are more than happy to pass those savings along to consumers and therefore drive price points and affordability to a better place as a whole. I think it's kind of where the industry started. You go back to go back to the early days of wireless and look at what it would cost for a minute of voice service, or the early days of data. They were far, far higher than prices are today. So there's a natural technology curve. The technology curve has a slope on it based on the evolution of technology and our ability to invest in it. But that curve also has a floor based on what are the inherent costs of operating in a particular country. The biggest cost drivers we have, I talked about them in my opening comments. First and foremost is population density and geographic area. I can't change that for Canada. It's just the fact that countries like ours that span 5 time zones and have a population density that's 1/10 that of the U.S. And 1/20th or 30th that of many European countries are more expensive to cover, period, especially if our goal is to leave no Canadian behind, if our goal is to extend the latest technology to 99% of Canadians. The second cost factor really has to do with the price of some of our inputs. Spectrum is a very expensive input. We spent $9 billion on spectrum since the first day of wireless. As I said, we pay a premium for that spectrum. If you compare it to the U.S., we're paying, in rough terms, 75% to 100% premium on the U.S. cost of spectrum. If you compare it to other countries, it's 2 or 5 times the amount that some of the European countries have paid for spectrum as a whole. And then there's the topic of equipment that is all priced in U.S. currency. So there's a natural floor to that curve. We'd like nothing more to continue increasing affordability because it's good for Canada and it will continue to drive adoption and data consumption. We are in some ways forecasting that we'll be able to deliver a unit cost of data more efficiently in the world of 5G. Hence this move to unlimited and the ability to actually lower prices. In one fell swoop last summer, we dropped that one plan. It used to cost about $100 for 10 gigabytes of data to $75 with unlimited on the plan as well. I mean, that was a big move.
We'll talk about that in a minute.
We thought about that for the better part of a year before even, taking that decision. So we're motivated to make those moves, but they're conditioned by the reality of investment and our ability to drive that curve.
I would just add, building on the 5G investments, the cost curves that ensue, and the unlimited decision in June of last year, that pricing trends and pricing developments in any market are inherently nonlinear. So they tend to have breakpoints and they move in single point events in large part. And I think we'd look no further than last June to see that a catalyst like the move to unlimited creates a breakpoint and a discontinuity in the pricing environment. And we see that as 5G rolls out, as Joe mentioned, that the ability for Canadians to use more data will drive a continued price per gigabyte down trend in the market. And I'm sure as new technologies within 5G and millimeter wave, et cetera, come to the market, there will be continued price compression on that price per gigabyte as we move forward.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. Just back to my original question, though. A number of parties, well, for example, TELUS suggested that the recent data in, for example, the Competition Bureau's examination is out of date. And I guess my core of my question was, do you think everything you said is, I'll accept, is arguably true, but it's true elsewhere? Are our rates going down faster or slower than other countries?
I think you're probably referring. There we go. I think you may be referring to the Competition Bureau chart, and Bell spoke about that, and others make the same point. That chart ended in 2018. So our prices have dramatically fallen since then. Your question is fair enough, don't dispute that. But what about other countries? Well, our view is, because another question we've heard is, it's fabulous that you have introduced the unlimited plan, but frankly, what took you so long?
It's one of my questions.
Yes, so I think it's fair to say our position, I think it's safe to assume, and we tell people never to do that here, but that our prices have fallen more than others because we have, as Brent said, introduced that breakpoint now with that very substantial change that in some other countries came a bit before. We do think, just to make the fundamental point, and you're talking about the international price comparisons, you really want to look to the American situation for the most comparable match to Canada in terms of the characteristics. And so that is the one that we would draw your attention to.
Thank you. I'll get you to reformulate all my questions. Your statement of my question was clearer than my question. You answered this in part in your opening remarks, Mr. Natale, with respect to the motivation behind the introduction of last June's reductions, but I'm sure, as you were referring, a number of interveners have questioned the timing. You've said it did not relate to the threat of regulatory intervention, but I should give you an opportunity to add to that. The point's been made. What say you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you were to spend time in my strategy meetings with my team, many of whom are here today, you would hear us talk about what are some of the next moves in the industry, often informed by what are the most important customer pain points that we see out there. We had that conversation a few years ago when the topic of discussion was roaming and how roaming is packaged or priced for Canadians, and that gave birth to the notion of roam like home. We've had this conversation around unlimited for the last, I would say, year in earnest and longer, frankly. The thing that's always held us back is that the market in Canada grew up with an overage regime or an overage structure that constituted a significant part of our economics. As you heard me say last summer, 5% of our revenue is in overage. We've been quickly melting that 5%, roughly $500 million has been quickly melting as people have adopted these plans. We did it because it's the right thing for consumers. We did it because consumers want that peace of mind. We did it because the 5G era is around the corner. We wanted to kind of create an environment where people feel comfortable and open in using more data as a whole. When we looked at it before, it was 2 years ago or so where overage was 10% of our revenue. So you get to a place where you say, when is the right moment where we're willing to rip off the Band-Aid and make the move? And we had the debate over a long period of time. We finally decided that we were ready to do it. We got great support from our board. We had a board meeting in June of last year where we talked about this topic at length. And we were very open about the fact that it would lead to financial pressure. As you saw later in the year, we revised our financial guidance, not something you do lightly in a public company, but we felt it was the right thing for consumers, and it's time to march on. So you can rely on us to keep looking at pain points as they come along and other opportunities to either remove customer friction or to create more affordable plans at all levels in the marketplace.
Thank you. Which I omitted when we were talking about your cost curve. You made a couple of references now to spectrum costs or fees specifically, and indicated that they were in the order of 7 times more than foreign jurisdictions or the U.S. Do you have documentation, or could you undertake to provide us with details as to how that was calculated or the source for it?
Yes, we can do that. The easy source is the GMSA efficient spectrum pricing, and that's the source of the numbers that Joe was mentioning: 1.75 times the U.S. level, 3.5 times higher here than in Australia, Italy, etc. And so the curve is there, and we'll file that with you.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you. We've heard a fair amount in the course of the proceeding relating to why there are differences, sometimes significant, sometimes not, between provinces with respect to rates, and notably in Quebec. You're a national player. How do you explain the difference in regional pricing in Quebec versus other regions or provinces?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would mention that as we look most recently and as the fourth carrier structure has emerged across the entirety of Canada in the last 2 or 3 years in a meaningful way, that the pricing variation across the province has actually normalized to a large degree. So we see on an everyday basis, all provinces, with the exception of Quebec, showing high levels of consistency in their pricing. I think the exhibits earlier in the submission or in the hearings supported that observation. So as we look forward, you will describe that as sort of the various market dynamics and structures in the various provinces have led to various pricing outcomes. Quebec seems to be, and has been in my experience in the industry, a persistent market where the pricing levels are different. And it's a little interesting in the sense that, for example, Alberta, where the pricing and the ARPU levels are higher, but the penetration is also higher. We see Quebec with the unique outcome where the pricing is lower, ARPUs are lower, but the penetration is also lower. And so that points to a market behavior, a consumer behavior that places perhaps less value on the latest technology or the amount of data that is being provided, and has created a persistent and enhanced competitive dynamic for any particular price point, because we've seen that demand for any levels of service just seem to be lower in Quebec, and has led to a more competitive dynamic around that.
And I would take it from that response that those are generally the factors that you take into account when you determine prices for a region? It's that set of considerations?
Well, I think it's important to note that when we determine prices, very much the market determines the prices. So we are but one player in a very competitive market, and very often I'm a price taker, not a price setter in a market. So we are responding and reacting to the moves of our competitors, and it's that dynamic, the demand levels of consumers, the behavior of my competitors, and our responses that ultimately define and shape the pricing. And as I said, in Quebec, there's a unique environment that has created a unique outcome.
And is a province the smallest geographic territory or market that you would look at in terms of establishing pricing, or would there be sub-markets where you would adjust pricing beyond that?
The level of pricing discrimination, like where we set, like the prices in Quebec, generally have been a provincial decision. So we wouldn't have, a price in Montreal that's different than a price in Quebec City. And you'll even see that Ottawa prices here reflect more prices in Quebec. But if you're more broadly in Ontario, you'll see a different price level, and that's been the structure of the industry, how the major players and all the players have behaved, is that the provincial boundaries have defined sort of what the prices have been in the various jurisdictions. For marketing reasons, I assume, as much as anything? Yes, I would say simplicity and defining where is the boundary. In no arbitrary sense, the provincial boundary becomes the natural place to put that line. And there may not be a single answer to this question, but what's the smallest region, in your view, where you might have a different price or package? That would be at a provincial level.
Let me just add one thought on this dialogue. I think it's important to understand that when we look at marketing and pricing and how it looks geographically, yes, the province is sort of the main cut, just given the expanse of Canada as a whole. But when it comes to promotional periods, when it comes to intensely hot periods like Black Friday or Boxing Week, there are often very aggressive promotions that are aimed at a particular city or a particular retail chain or sometimes a particular shopping mall. So there's a whole promotional intensity, and bear in mind that the majority of our volume actually happens during these promotional periods. There are about 40 to 50 days a year that make up a substantive amount of our volume, in fact, a massive amount of our volume. And they're the periods you might imagine, back to school, Black Friday, over the holiday period through Boxing Week. And there you'll see very targeted things that are often, as we call them, back pocket offers. They're just happening in a channel, they're not advertised, and through our competitive intelligence, because every weekend we send people out to do mystery shopping. Every weekend we send people out to look at what's happening in all banners, all stores, and come back for the Monday meeting that Brent holds. It says, what did you learn this weekend? Well, we saw that competitor X is offering this particular bonus or offer or gift card in that particular channel, et cetera. And in fact, the people on the ground often will respond to that very quickly. But during these intense periods, we have, for lack of a better descriptor, a war room that is staffed by marketing people that are making in-the-moment pricing decisions because of the intensity of those periods. And if you look at the proportion of our customers that get something on a promotion, it's massive. It's the vast majority of customers get something on a promotion during those periods.
Thank you. This question probably belongs in another part of my questions, but you just referenced looking at your competitors' offerings. We've heard a couple of times in this proceeding from those in particular who support MVNOs that there's little product differentiation in offers between the big three, Is that part of the reason for that? That you are closely examining your competitors' offerings and then matching or bettering it?
The market is intensely competitive and highly efficient. It's no different than 3 gas stations on a corner. If one of them changes the price of gas, the other 2 quickly get up on the ladder and change the price of gas. And we have a strong pulse of market intelligence, and the reaction time is very quick in any part of the particular market. At the end of the day, there are no real structural advantages anymore. There was a time in our history when there was a structural advantage around a particular network technology, CDMA versus GSM, or the structural advantage around whether you had the iPhone and someone else didn't. Now technology has pretty much become ubiquitous. Everybody's got every technology at their disposal. And therefore we really do compete on a combination of customer service and price. Because as a service provider, we have no other structural advantage.
Thank you. We'll probably come back to that theme when we talk about 5G later on. Mr. Watt.
Just wonder this, Richard, would you like to weigh in on this, on basically competitive markets? What is a competitive market around the world in wireless? How they structure, in reference to the chairperson's question?
I think the way that, at least in my experience, other regulators and as a member of the Competition Authority, I would think about it, is we're obviously trying to find another, what is the relevant competitive benchmark for the Canadian wireless market. I've heard a lot about comparisons with other countries. It's an obvious thing to do, to go and look at another market that you think is competitive and say, well, the performance in that market gives us a benchmark against which we then compare Canada. My view and my experience is that you can attach some weight to those sorts of comparisons, but not a great deal, because there are simply too many other variables involved in these cross-country comparisons to really allow you to draw very strong conclusions. In my experience, what people tend to look at much more is not historic measures of market performance, such as HHIs and market shares. That tells you something about how people have got to where they are today, but it doesn't tell you very much about what's going on today. But the standard measure that I've seen in wireless markets certainly is shares of net additions would be the most would be the measure that I would attach greatest weight to, because that gives you an indication of the current competitive capabilities of the different parties. And I observe in Canada that in that case, the regional carriers appear to be performing very strongly now in terms of their share of net additions. The other point I would make that I would also attach quite a bit of weight to is a point that Joe made in his opening remarks, which is ultimately to look at the relationship between the returns, the revenues, and the returns on assets that firms are earning and their cost of capital. Because that takes into account pricing, quality, differences in costs, and all the other factors. And in my view would be the sort of standard view of how you would think about, is this market competitive and firms are earning reasonable returns on their assets, or is it a market where we see there's a problem?
Thank you. Change provinces, we talked about Quebec for a moment. In reference to Manitoba, in your May intervention, you emphasized that XploreNet's entry in Manitoba ensured that there would be continuation of a fourth carrier and therefore continuing levels of competition. We've seen some information in the course of the proceeding that suggests that the prices actually rose initially following the merger. But that said, since that time, it seems that except for the larger plans, pricing in Manitoba and Saskatchewan is now generally in line with that of other provinces. Is that a fair assessment of how you see the market, and how would you assess XploreNet's impact on the competitive environment in Manitoba?
I would agree that I think that is a fair assessment of how the market has shaped up since that time. We've seen that the intensity levels continue to increase over time more broadly across Canada, and that has led to an equilibration of pricing across those markets. And I see that actually persisting and moving forward now.
Thank you. You've already made reference to this in your opening remarks, Mr. Natali, but perhaps more in response to one of my questions, when you talked about the cost curve of being a mobile provider. And you have, I think, in your, again, May intervention, talked about the declining per unit price of mobile wireless data over roughly the last 5 years. But I also assume you were listening to the hearing yesterday, and you may have heard Mr. Lawford's reference to magic math. Effectively not, I mean, the transcript speaks for itself, but Mr. Lawford was suggesting that cost declines can and should happen every year, and therefore increased data allowance should happen naturally. So the price decreases if, to the extent that we're characterizing increased data as part of the increased benefit to consumer, is a bit of a smoke and mirrors exercise. Would you care to respond to that?
I find that highly disappointing, that characterization. George referenced the fact that 70% of our capital costs are civil engineering costs, are people that are clearing roads, building towers. Well, the price of that labor is not going down in Canada, it's going up. And in fact, almost any direct comparison with the U.S. to Canada, you find that we pay our employees and our suppliers that provide those services far better income than in many parts of the U.S. In fact, if you compare us to the state of Florida, it's roughly half the amount per hour for a technician that is clearing a road or building a tower. We talked about spectrum already and that analogous cost around spectrum. We talked about the fact that we buy our equipment in U.S. dollars. A lot of our plans include the cost of the phone, The price of the phone is going up, not down. I talked about that in my opening remarks. So, we're working hard to drive unit cost as we find better technologies that make better use of spectrum, with dynamic spectrum sharing that would give us more bang for our buck on spectrum. As we find these opportunities, as I said before, we pass them along to consumers. They're not natural. They don't just happen randomly or accidentally. They happen because of the investments that we're making every year to drive that capability and that opportunity.
Thank you. A little bit of a change of subject. What about network quality, generally speaking? Is there much of a difference in network quality across the province, across the country, rather? If you're looking at a provincial level, are there variations in network quality from one to another? You mentioned earlier, we discussed earlier, that prices were generally lower in Quebec. Is there a differentiation in network quality between Quebec and elsewhere, for example?
Thank you for the question. We have standard engineering policies that we apply across the country. From an engineering point of view, we don't think about the country on a province-by-province basis. We have central engineering teams that define quality parameters and standards that apply across the entire country. And then these parameters are managed and maintained by the teams on a regional basis. So at any given moment, any difference in quality that might exist is always a temporary one and would have been as a result of a particular market situation where, for instance, an increase in consumption of data in a particular area, a particular city, might then drive up the congestion in that particular city. That will then obviously degrade the quality parameters. And then obviously that is managed by the local teams to bring the quality of the network back up to the standard parameters that we establish. And we have those obviously for voice and for data to ensure that our customers experience exactly the same service across the whole country.
Thank you. So by design, there's no differentiation. Does it follow then that network quality is not taken into account when setting prices in various provinces?
The quality is taken into account in as much as there is a very close alignment between the engineering and the marketing departments whenever we're thinking about a new plan, a new product. So we will consider what the impact of that new product might be, it might have on the network. And if we believe that the impact is going to be significant, then we make sure that we take into account the investments required to maintain that quality of service. So to give you an example, before we launched our infinite plans, we had obviously a deep discussion in terms of what the forecasting of data growth impact would be on the network across the whole country. And then based on that forecasting, we made sure that we provided the investments necessary to obviously add the capacity required to maintain that quality, wherever it might be.
Thank you. Mr. Watt?
Yes, from an economist's spin on that, I would say that the overall level of prices is set to accommodate the costs of the network quality, but then within any particular region, as we've seen in Quebec, we then deal with demand characteristics that are unique of each of the individual markets, or where the demand is significantly different, even though the network quality is identical. To get customers on the network to drive revenue, we will have to make differences in the price plans. Understood.
Thank you. And does that, I guess all of that, both from a technical and the perspective of an economist, does that hold true for the flanker brands? Is that equally true for Fido and Chatter?
The networks that serve our customers are the same networks. And so the differentiation that we have currently is with Chatter, where the customers are on our 3G network. So we have a 2G, a 3G, 4G, and a 5G network. Our chatr customers use our 3G network more or less dedicated, and so it depends on the device that they would have otherwise for other brands, whether they would attach to one or another network.
And generally, you've probably heard a fair amount of discussion over the past week or so that there's broad consumer, we can call it confusion or lack of information with respect to the flanker brands as to whether or not they are of inferior quality. And you've probably, again, heard our discussion past several interveners, whether or not they think that a hesitation to subscribe to flanker brands is driven perhaps by a sense that it is inferior quality. You've also no doubt heard the different approaches expressed by Bell with respect to the management of its flanker brands versus the approach identified by TELUS. So that's a bunch of questions in one, but if you'd care to respond.
I'll start and then ask Brent to add to it. We are very proud of the network quality that our flanker brands represent. And if you were to look on the website and look at the maps that show the network, or you walk into a Fido store and speak to one of our representatives there, they would extol the virtues and quality and reach of that network and tell you unequivocally that it's the same network that the Rogers brand lives on. So we make no bones about that, and very proud of that fact. Where the brands are delineated is they speak to different parts of the market, and there are certain capabilities that live in each of the brands. So Rogers, by definition, is a premium brand with high-touch service and a person to answer the phone and be there for every interaction. It's a brand that allows sharing and share plans and share constructs. It's a brand that will allow any phone whatsoever to be now financed, originally subsidized, et cetera. Whereas the Fido brand is meant to be more of a digitally present brand that doesn't provide sharing in the construct, and certain handsets are not eligible as lower assortment overall. So it's meant to be tuned to a part of the market that is in a different sort of affordability strata, and therefore lower price points, and therefore a lower level of support as a result. So we try to tune these brands specifically in that manner.
I would also add that if you look at the mix of our gross additions and the customers coming to us, there's a very, very healthy mix of Rogers, Fido, and chatr. So I would say that that would demonstrate a very open and transparent understanding from consumers to which choices they're making, and given the way those brands are tuned to satisfy the needs of various customer segments. So that'll be point number one. Point number two, when you look into a mall in Canada and look at the opportunity to make that choice transparently, you would look no further than, say, perhaps the Rideau Centre here in Ottawa, and discover 13 different opportunities or places to buy wireless. Some are exclusive, so they sell one brand only. Some are non-exclusive, they sell multiple brands. Very, very often, they are located very close to each other, so the Fido store is very, very often very close, sometimes co-located next door to a Rogers store and very close to a Koodo, Virgin, and a TELUS and a Bell store. And so it becomes very easy for consumers to walk across and have these conversations and discover the various attributes of the service offerings and the network qualities. And then, as I mentioned, the vast majority of places in Canada are actually non-exclusive, where all of the brands are represented, and the salespeople there are trained by the various brands on all the pros of their particular offerings, and they can go and get that one-stop shop and be able to cross-compare very, very efficiently. And thirdly, of course, is all of this information is widely and broadly available online on your mobile phone in the moment or at home, and that makes it even more efficiently available to consumers to compare and make these decisions. So the information is there. The shopping environment itself actually facilitates, very much like an auto mall, the cross comparison of all these different attributes and makes it quite transparent.
Let me just add, just to give some dimension to it, there are 2,500 places in Canada where you can buy one of our products, one of our wireless products. About 1,500 of them are places that carry multiple, and when I say multiple, I mean competitor brands as well. So the majority of those locations are places where customers can readily compare. If you walk into a Best Buy, or walk into a Walmart, or walk into a wireless wave or telephone booth, these are all multi-banner, multi-product locations, and given that the sales representatives in those locations make their money on their ability to convince a customer to do something, whether it's their bonus or their commission, et cetera, they're very well versed in comparing and contrasting one against the other. And anytime there's even a minute difference in some opportunity, whether it's price or data, et cetera, it quickly shifts the volume, which is quickly understood by the competitor and ameliorated. So the market works very much efficiently, as I said before, and every day in the vast majority of locations across Canada, the brands are side by side on a display and being talked about by the customer sales representative.
Thank you. Again, changing gears a little bit. On the Capex front, you've already talked a little bit about the significant 5G investment requirements. With LTEA mostly deployed, where are you right now in your investment cycle?
We continue to invest on our current infrastructure. So as I said before, in order to maintain the network quality across the country, we continue to invest even on LTEA as we speak. In 2019 alone, we deployed over 300 sites, new sites with LTEA, and we have similar plans to continue even with the advent of 5G.
You made reference, Rogers made reference to itself and its national competitors punching well above their weight, to quote your evidence. I think the numbers were $95 per subscriber in Capex in 2018, which you submitted was more than the per sub levels in the U.S. You may want to answer this particular question by way of undertaking, but I'll ask you in any event. Would you be able to give us that number for 2019? I don't know if that needs to be in confidence or not. And do you have any estimates of what that number will be in the coming years as associated with 5G?
Yeah, I think certainly no problem providing that number for 2019. In fact, we've already released our fourth quarter results, so we know we spent roughly $1.3 billion in wireless last year, up from $1 billion the year before. So we can turn that into the per capita and per sub. And I think, subject to check, I believe we gave a forecast of our Capex for 2020, but we'll check if we haven't. We'll give it to you in an undertaking. The one thing I would add, though, when you look at those charts, I would encourage you to add the spectrum cost to the physical plant and equipment capital expenditure, which those charts only show now. Point being that over the last 6 years, we've spent $6 billion in wireless property, plant and equipment, traditional Capex. We've spent almost $6.1 billion on spectrum. And spectrum is equally needed, and there's a trade-off there in the sense that when you have more spectrum, George can elaborate, this is my layman's explanation, that decreases the need for additional cells to a point. It's a trade-off spectrum and then cell sites. Therefore, I think to get an accurate picture, you really need to look at the sum of the two. And there we know In the property, plant, and equipment, Australia looks like it's more. But I know in comparison, Telstra spent 1.3 billion Canadian over the past 6 years for spectrum. We spent 6.1 billion. And both those components of the expenditure need to be looked at in a chart of that nature.
You could certainly include that analysis in your response, undertaking response. I should give you an opportunity to respond as well to the more broad issue of if the Commission were to mandate MVNO access, how would that impact those investment numbers? You can feel free to answer that now, or you can include that in your response to the undertaking.
I'd be happy to address that question. We can certainly follow up with more specificity if it's required. If there is mandated MVNO access that impacts our investment thresholds, then investment will be reduced. And investment will be reduced in the places where the economics of that investment no longer make sense. You asked the question, Mr. Chair, a few minutes ago around where we stood with LTE Advanced. You know, if you go back 5 years ago on LTE Advanced, we were sitting at roughly 83% of Canada covered. This year, we're at 95%. We'll make our way to 99 in the time ahead. I would tell you the last 5 or 10% is the hardest because of population density. As you know, 48% of Canadians live in the big major cities. The 52% that do not live spread across our vast landscape. And if you were to sit in one of our capital investment meetings where George gets his money to build those 300 new towers and to add $1.3 billion of capacity, it is a serious discussion where we take every single request for capital, and in any given year there are far more requests than we have affordability for. We rank them one by one over a 20, 30-page spreadsheet, and we rank them based on the expected return from that particular investment. And then we draw a line around our affordability based on the 5% return on invested capital, all the other metrics I talked about earlier, and anything above the line gets done, anything below the line doesn't get done. So what will happen is that line will be further up the page, and that line will impact rural Canada in the most significant way. Right now, as I said earlier, we enjoy some of the best networks in the world. The fact that we're second only to South Korea, in many ways, we're a global superpower when it comes to network capability and network coverage as a whole. The U.S. has speeds that are on average half of Canadian speeds. If you were to draw that table, Canada would be number 2, the U.S. would be number 30 on that list, France would be 19, Germany would be 24. If rural Canada were a country, it would rank 14th on that list, far above the U.S. and the U.K. That's the benefit of having a regulatory regime that supports this investment, because we are fortunate in Canada not to have a very significant, in fact, a very small digital divide when it comes to wireless. On the wireline side of our business, about 15% of Canadians across the industry, as you know, 15% of homes in Canada either have no internet or have very poor internet. There is a real and significant digital divide in our country that we're desperately trying to figure out ways of closing between government programs, CRTC programs, and our own efforts. We are blessed that we don't have that kind of divide on the wireless side. If we change the economic thesis of our industry, we will open up a digital divide on the wireless part of our world, which I think would be a shame. Would be a shame. 99% of Canadians is, I think, a trophy on our mantle as a country. I want to keep it there.
Thank you. Talk for a moment about barriers to entry. In your November intervention, you submitted that barriers to entry in the mobile market are low. Obviously, there's some differing views. Shaw, for example, indicated last week that in addition to paying $1.6 billion for its acquisition of wind, they've undertaken billions in further investments, including $400 million per year upgrading and expanding their network. That doesn't sound like an insignificant barrier. Similarly, Mr. Bragg, when he appeared, also outlined what he described as his difficulty experienced by a privately held company as it endeavors to build out. So I guess I'd like to ask you again, is that still your view that there are not significant barriers to entry to the mobile wireless market?
Okay, I don't recall that statement. It's obviously there. You can give me the
I should say
reference.
paragraph 80 of 22 November intervention.
Okay, I'll take a look at that, but for the
Hopefully
reasons,
I haven't mischaracterized it.
No, for the reasons you outlined, they're clearly substantial barriers to entry for a facilities-based entrant. There's no question about that. Having said that, I'll stop. I'll go read that reference.
We can
see what we said. See if it was
come back to it. Hopefully I haven't misquoted you.
Howard, I think, can explain our
no.
potential momentary minute of madness.
No, I don't think it was a moment of madness, and I don't think we were trying to say that there's not a cost to enter the market. I think the point was that with the government support, with set-aside, spectrum caps, mandatory roaming, the fourth carrier policy of the government has enabled entry by these players, and they've been able to do it at a much lower price than otherwise they could have done. So the barriers are actually they're not insurmountable. People have been investing in wireless networks in this country over the last 10 years with the help of the government. And so it's not basically a free market to enter. The barriers are actually being kind of brought down by the government.
Thank you. That is helpful. So based on that, to what extent do you think it's possible that we'll see a potential new entrant, regional or otherwise?
Well, it's always possible. I mean, if the government keeps providing assistance during auctions, there's always the opportunity for somebody to come along and take advantage of the set-aside or the cap. I think you also have an opportunity now with ExploreNet, who has a lot of 3,500 megahertz spectrum, who was just recently acquired by a large investment fund, so they have the potential. But I think there's a real market difference between possibility and probability. I don't think you witness a lot of market entry in a competitive market where prices are declining every single year. So even if the opportunity is there, whether or not somebody actually tries to enter seems questionable.
Fair enough. So let me say the question differently, but I think the answer will probably be the same. Do you expect, let's say in a 5-year time horizon, do you expect to see new entry in the Canadian market? Facilities-based entry, deploying spectrum?
We can't be certain. We've seen ExploreNet come in as a fourth in Manitoba. We actually have 5 actually in the Ottawa region. As to somebody else coming in, I think I'm going to ask Richard maybe to comment on sort of from the global perspective, 4 to 5, 4 to 3. But in a country of 36 million people spread across this huge landmass, already with 4 facilities-based competitors, 5 in some locations, and the sub-brands, the spectrum that's been given out, the spectrum that remains, I think it would be difficult to see another facilities-based competitor arrive.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, just to add, if you look at this market from the perspective of an outside observer, Canada is a bit of an outlier in going from 3 to 4 facilities-based, full facilities-based competitors. The trend, certainly in Europe, to some extent in the United States and elsewhere in the world, has been towards a greater concentration in facilities-based markets. I would say over the period of certainly the last 5 years, typically markets are moving down from 4 to 3 carriers elsewhere in the world. To the extent that that indicates anything about how the economics of the industry is changing, then the move would not be towards additional entry.
Thank you. Network sharing arrangements. You have one with Videotron. Can you talk to me a little about what your rationale or reasons were at the time for entering into that agreement?
Sure. At the time, go back in time, and this is before my time, so I'll ask David to fill in as appropriate. At the time, we had a resale arrangement with Videotron as they were looking to enter the wireless market. That resale arrangement turned into a network sharing agreement. We looked at it specifically and said, given the extent of the network build we want to do in Quebec, given the opportunity to share infrastructure, we believe there is an opportunity to share some of the capital load between two providers, maintain, of course, our competitive distinction delineation, but share the capital load with respect to towers and fiber and the rest. And we embarked on that path to strike a network sharing agreement. That network sharing agreement now is evolving. It's evolving to one where we will be sharing infrastructure, meaning we will be sharing towers and backhaul. So philosophically, from our perspective, if there's an opportunity to strike a network sharing agreement that makes sense for Rogers and makes sense, of course, with the other partner, then we're open to the idea or the construct. We do so thoughtfully and carefully. I'll ask George to comment. Network sharing agreements are very hard to orchestrate, very hard to manage over time. In Europe, the experience has been a troublesome one, with agreements unraveling over time, so we do it with a very thoughtful eye. Our view generally is that sharing passive infrastructure makes sense. Sharing spectrum is more difficult, and I believe fundamentally in a 5G world even more problematic as 5G evolves into multi-dimensional applications and ideas for each of the players in the market.
Before you add, maybe I can just throw in another element to the question, which would be, have you been approached by any other regional MNO to enter into a similar agreement?
The short answer is we have. We have. And
successfully or I guess maybe.
Yeah, I won't comment on the state of any particular negotiations, whether they're old or current. I don't think it's fair given the confidentiality around some of those discussions, but of course we will always address and look at opportunities as they come along.
So I'll take it as that you are prepared to negotiate with such network sharing agreements with other carriers.
Absolutely. If it's in the best interests of Rogers and our future, more than happy to do so. If it helps to deploy technology more efficiently and reach more of Canada more efficiently, extend further into rural Canada, absolutely, we're open to the idea.
I would just say, and you're aware of this, we have a network sharing arrangements with T-Baytel, and we also do in Manitoba. It was originally with MTS, and then it was in the BCE acquisition of MTS that was assigned over in a revised format, and again involves ExploreNet, etc., to make that deal workable. In terms of any type of network sharing agreement, you really need two partners who bring relatively equal value to the table, and that is the issue that either makes a network sharing arrangement happen or makes one not happen. There has to be a relative equal value brought to the situation by both parties.
Thank you.
Just to maybe add a bit of color to the statements that have been made. The balance of interest between both sharing parties is incredibly important. And this is why we believe that if there is a balance of needs, then we are open to sharing. I think it's also important to differentiate on the kinds of sharing that exist. Again, here we believe, I mentioned in the opening statement that 70% of the costs of building a network are down to the civil works, the steel, the cement, the infrastructure. And so this is what we would call passive sharing arrangements, and we are very open to passive sharing arrangements. Where it becomes more complex is when you have active sharing arrangements, when you extend to the electronics, to the radios, to the frequencies that you own, and especially in situations where there is an imbalance of ownership of spectrum, then it tends to become very complex. Parties tend to have different strategies, different markets that they want to address, different needs in capacity, and so on and so forth. And so this is where the discussion enters on, one of the parties want to invest and the other one not wanting to make that respective investment. And so that tends to complicate sharing agreements. I think it's also important to say in the Canadian context that regardless of what sharing agreements we may come to implement, I think it's fair to say that none of these sharing agreements would match the sharing arrangement that exists between Bell and TELUS, where that particular sharing arrangement, I think, is unique in probably every circumstance, even at a global level, where both parties have been allowed to share spectrum, and this in a Canadian context where it is incredibly expensive to acquire said spectrum in what are incredibly complex auction environments where the parties are able to essentially set the price of the other. Bell and TELUS have the ability more or less to set the price of spectrum that we pay, and we have very little to no chance of doing the same. And then bidding as an individual operator and then joining that spectrum is obviously something that certainly I haven't seen anywhere else in the world, and does create an imbalance when it comes to sharing arrangements in this country.
Thank you. That will let me move on in 1 second to, believe it or not, that was part one. Hope you're settled in. But before I leave it, I do have a short list. Maybe I can save legal counsel some work later on. There are a number of reports that were used in the May intervention, and I'm not certain that they are all on the public record. Perhaps I'll read them quickly and for the transcript, and you can see them later. But if you could undertake to file any that are not on the public record. We had the open signal reports, the 5G opportunity dated February 2019, Mobile Network Experience Report Canada dated February 2019, Mobile Network Experience Report US January 2019, and the open signal reports listed in footnote 11 of your May 2019 submission. There's also an Ericsson mobility report and a CWTA report, the benefits of the wireless telecommunications industry to the Canadian economy in 2017. Lastly, in your 22nd November further comments, at page 17, figure 1, there's a reference to compound annual decline in ARPU in the G7 and Australia, 2013 to 2018. If you could please undertake to file the data used to calculate those compound annual growth rates. You can guess I did not make up that list.
Yes, we will provide those documents and the calculation.
Thank you. All right. A few questions about the retail market. You have heard, I assume, Mr. Natali, you hear it a lot in your day-to-day business. We certainly hear it. There is a view from Canadians that prices for their wireless services are not reasonable. How do you explain that? We have heard a lot in this proceeding. about the range of offers, the effectiveness of flanker brands, notwithstanding the quality and coverage of the network, there is nevertheless a continuing view that prices are not reasonable. Why is that there? What's your explanation for it?
I think, generally speaking, that Canadians broadly have concerns about affordability, period. A whole bunch of different categories in terms of affordability. We did an exhaustive survey last year and asked Canadians the question, if you could have better affordability for something, what would you like it for? And with the support of Nanos, we did a survey across Canada. And wireless was ranked as 7th or 8th on that list on the 2 different surveys that we did. And the top 5 were, no surprise, housing, food, electricity, gasoline, and out-of-pocket pharmacare costs. So generally speaking, I think that life is becoming more expensive as a whole, and there's a general view that if people can get a better price or better affordability for something, they would like it. We're frankly well aligned with that mission and that view. We want nothing more than to offer Canadians more affordable options and more affordable opportunities with respect to wireless services. It's actually in our best interest to do so because it will continue to drive demand for our product, continue to drive penetration rates in Canada, continue to drive the essential use of wireless services as a whole, especially on the doorstep of 5G, as we've discussed. If you look at any of the comparisons that we've drawn, we've talked about the U.S. with respect to unlimited plans. The entry-level unlimited plan in the U.S. On T-Mobile is $80 Canadian. On Verizon, it's $92 Canadian. If you look at the MVNOs in the U.S., specifically Ting has a 1 gig plan at $29 Canadian. Republic has a 1 gig plan at $27 Canadian. Well, the Fido version of that is $30 and the Virgin version of that is $28. So by a very empirical comparison, we're roughly in the same zone as the U.S. I think it's just the view that as people use more of a particular service and they like using more of that service, there is a desire to make it more affordable. I do think that the approach that the industry took to overage historically created dissonance. A lot of the customer friction that you're articulating, I believe, is rooted in the fact that bill shock became a major point of customer friction. One of our goals and mandates has been to eradicate this notion of bill shock. On the Rogers brand, it's the move to unlimited. And on the Fido brand, we created something that's called worry-free data protection. That is a very customer-friendly way of managing your data plan and has been well received and lauded by our customers as a result. So I think as we remove those friction points, drive those likelihood to recommend or customer satisfaction scores, continue to drive more affordability, that will be in a better stead with Canadians as a whole. Historically, we've given Canadians a lot more to think about and complain about, whether it's bill shock or a customer service issue, et cetera. My personal mandate and vision and drive is to eradicate those friction points and just create a better relationship with Canadians as a whole and keep driving affordability, frankly.
Well, we certainly wish you luck in that regard. How do you promote your lower cost plans? Are they as much a focus as the higher or larger data plans, for example? And what can you tell us about the supporting materials, training manuals, customer care, and the like that goes with that.
Yeah. I think I'll preface that with, I think, a constant refrain and conversation around just how vigorous the competition for subscribers are in light of the net added success of our regional players, that every service rep in every store is vigorously trying to encourage and convince customers to buy with them and for the offerings that they provide. So that creates, I think, a backdrop for our then desire to satisfy and deliver to those reps the materials and all of the information, both on the higher tier plans, but also on the low-cost data plans, everything they need to be successful in that endeavor. So there is the same treatment for the high-end plans than there is for the low-end plans or the low-cost data plans. And similarly on our websites, they're also similarly available and available for people to see. So there's every effort made to make them as transparent as possible, but again, rooted in this desire to ensure that we have the right thing for that right customer when they walk into our store.
And does your promotion or advertising for some of those lower cost plans, do they target any particular demographic market, seniors or new Canadians, for example?
Certainly, the first conversation in a store from the rep is largely around discovery and understanding the unique needs of that particular customer. And it's really that conversation that opens up the door to the rep to be saying, well, here's what I have that can help solve that need for you. So insofar as those conversations are happening every day across the thousands and thousands of stores across Canada, yes, there is a discern effect to ensure that the right solution is being presented to the customer given their unique needs.
A bit of a, I don't know, call it a sidestep, a shuffle, but you used the word vigorous when you described your agents or employees explaining and offering their services. Obviously, we not so long ago had a proceeding to look at aggressive and misleading sales practices. I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a chance to tell us how you think you're doing in light of the issues raised in that proceeding and since then.
Well, first of all, my vigorous comment was really around the vigorous competition and that risk. I will say that we are in a repeat business, meaning customers stay with us. Our desire is for them to stay with us as long as possible. So the quality of the conversation at the beginning of that relationship is very, very central to the quality of the relationship that ensues. And so reps deeply understand that when they have the right conversation, present the right solution, they are developing an ongoing relationship with a customer. And those customers often come back to the same store and talk to the same rep about their ongoing needs. We have implemented, and have had in place, the structures and the training and the infrastructure to ensure that those conversations happen appropriately. I might hand it off to David or Joe to talk more specifically.
First of all, we take the issue of sales practices very seriously. We've worked very hard to drive the right behavior, the right training, and deal with any issues that come along. We have 13,000 team members that interact with customers every single day. It's a great team. They care deeply about the customer. Yes, from time to time there may be some small but some behavior that is not right, which we quickly kind of find and deal with. Eric Aegis was here in that hearing last year and spoke at length around our sales practices and what we're doing about it. He's done a great job of actually driving that to a new place, a new height for us overall. In fact, Eric was just recently promoted to Chief Customer Officer for Rogers, which really means that he bears the burden of responsibility for customer advocacy at our table. reporting to me directly. And I think that'll help to enshrine not just a focus on this topic, but more broadly the customer as a whole and having a voice at my table.
Thank you. And I was going to ask you if you would, if you could file training manuals and other documents that show how you teach your sales representatives to propose or describe those low-cost plans. And that relates to the earlier discussion, not the discussion we just had about misleading and aggressive sales practices. I just, as you've heard from other parties, would be interested in seeing your training materials in relation to how you describe and promote those brands.
We will provide that information. Can I maybe do a sideways shuffle back to, I think, 2 questions ago? And this was the sort of the threshold question of general perception, your prices are too high. This is a real problem. What do you have to say in your defense? And Joe has explained our view there. This is a real conundrum because the thesis goes that, well, if your prices are too high, and then the next statement is, quote, one of the interveners, they were advocating for MVNO on the basis that the goal should be to immediately reduce excess profit taking from the big 3. So the connection between these high prices and excess profit. And if there's one message we'd like to get across to you today amongst many, is that no, that happy solution of stripping a layer of big excess profits off the carriers to lower prices and still have everything continue on, that scenario isn't an accurate scenario. We've outlined in our opening statement the 5.1% return on net assets, and people sometimes question that number. They say, well, your plant is mostly depreciated. No, that 5.1% number is calculated on the net book value of that plant, what is undepreciated so far. This, almost, you could go and put your money into a long government bond at 4%. 5.1% with the risk that we bear is not evidence of excess profits. In fact, those are the profits that we need to continue to run our business. So this is the conundrum. People think the high prices, big profits, therefore, and then vice versa, and you get into a mindset thinking that you can sort of have it all. So we really need to, from our perspective, break this perception of high prices, because we understand the problem it causes for us, for you, for Canadians, and the danger that it generates for the fundamental development of the industry going forward. And that's long enough.
Well, thank you. You've clearly put it on the record for our consideration. So instead of talking about high prices, how about we talk about low prices for a second? There's been some discussion, for example, about the success of the Connecting Canadian Families program on the wireline broadband side as providing us with an example of perhaps what might be done in respect of mobile services. What are your thoughts about to what extent that would be feasible? And if it were feasible, need it be means tested? Give you the floor.
I'm going to start off again. I pretty much said what I was going to say as a framing of this particular question. And again, it is the situation of we have all these competing objectives. We want to have a high-quality network. We want to build more rural and remote locations. We want to deploy 5G broadly. And then we have some of the pricing issues that work in the other direction. I'm going to pass it over to Joe. I will say that we certainly very proud of our wireline initiatives in this area with our own initiative, Connected for Success, in rent geared to income community housing that has been out in the market for 6-7 years. It's now a 25 megabit per second service at $10, and there is an eligibility qualification around that. So certainly in the wireline side, we've gone down this path, and we are participants, willing participants in the Connecting Families program of ISED, which we really see as a complement to our program. That one is addressed at households who receive the maximum child care benefit. And Joe, over to you.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that we're philosophically aligned with. As David mentioned, we're proud of our Connected for Success program that we launched on our own initiative in 2015, and now supports 25,000 low-income households. We'd be happy to sit down with the right people to figure out some of the complexities around it. You hit the nail on the head. One of the complexities is means testing. What is the right approach to means testing? And secondly, how do we architect and structure that program in terms of price point, in terms of amount of data, et cetera, requires some careful thought and discussion. And thirdly, how do you make sure that you direct it to the people that really do deserve it, and doesn't fall prey to augmentation unnecessarily and takes it away from the people that deserve it? Because in the case of the Connect for Success, we can connect it to the household itself. Mobility, by its definition, is a mobile service, and the question is it the individual, is it the family? How do we characterize that? But suffice it to say that we're more than happy to entertain that discussion, and it would be great to launch something that makes sense in Canada with the right parties at the table to discuss how we deal with the complexities.
Mr. Lawford, I mentioned means testing, which was not what was proposed by consumer groups that we've heard from. You've indicated that's one of the complexities. Mr. Lawford yesterday indicated that he thought it shouldn't be a concern given the relatively low cost of a program. Is there a serious risk for providers if they don't have to means test, don't have to do a credit check with respect to postpaid? I think setting aside devices.
Okay, we may have misunderstood then. We heard the discussion yesterday around line 150 of the income tax return as potentially being a means of qualifying eligibility. There's a substantial difference between a program that has eligibility qualifications as opposed to a wide open program, which exacerbates greatly the concerns that Joe raised.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. I misspoke. I should have said with respect to credit checks. Put Mr. Lawford's comment in the appropriate context. When asked about prepaid versus postpaid, and the recommendation was for postpaid, and then with respect to postpaid, a need for a credit check. So I misspoke.
Terrific.
But your views on that, pardon me.
So the court, go, Brad.
First of all, I would say that the distinction between prepaid and postpaid, in a world where on our Fido brand we have the data overage protection that Joe mentioned, where your data allotment stops at the end, and then you decide if you want to go over. And if you use it, and then on prepaid, on the other hand, if you get to the end of your purchased data, you can buy more. I would say that the concerns over credit, distinct from handset, do sort of fade away in some respect, and I would say that the prepaid option in that construct mimics almost entirely the postpaid, and so they start to mimic one another, and I think there's a lot of space between those two constructs. to create a value proposition for customers, for those customers, that makes sense and that does not really create a user experience differential that would be meaningful at all. So I think, subject to going into the details of that, I think there's a lot of room to solve and not make, I guess the concern being, will credit be a barrier? I think credit needn't be a barrier to providing and satisfying the needs that were presented yesterday.
Thank you. You introduced a number of low-cost data-only plans with some urging from the Commission in 2018. What have we learned from that process? I'll stop there.
We've learned, first of all, we have a substantial number of people on those plans, and we've described the process by which they're promoted in store, that there is a segment there that has adopted those plans, and that continues. At the same time, we're also seeing that Canadians' desire for full solutions remains intact, and there's many Canadians that are looking for other alternatives. And so we see that there's been a healthy balance between the low-cost data only, but also the in-market plans, which are very close to those offerings as well. So that the balance of that has been, I would say, a very healthy outcome for the market and for us.
Just more broadly. Sorry, go ahead.
Really, it was interesting to see the attractiveness of having voice and text included with the data. Even though a substantially bigger package of data without voice and text is not as appealing. I think we had thought with low-cost data only appeal to people who would obviously use a fair bit of Wi-Fi, but also would use a voice app on the data. And it really hasn't proven to be the case. People, the talk and text plans have proven to be more attractive. These are ones that we introduced in conjunction with the $30 1 gig data only plan there in March. But talk and text, very popular.
Thank you. I'll maybe come back to the issue of credit checks on postpaid plans in a second, but before I do, you will have seen Commission's Exhibit 3, which provides a summary of the low-cost plans that have been proposed by consumer groups. There's a range that have been proposed. You heard submissions yesterday. How feasible in your view would it be for you to offer a plan with similar attributes to those proposed, recognizing there is a range both in terms of price and the data allowances in the plans at a price between $20 and $30?
I'll start off by saying that a 4 gigabyte rate plan today with unlimited nationwide talk and text postpaid is in the very heart of the Fido value proposition as it stands today, and appeals to a very wide berth of Canadians. So the introduction of a plan in the $20 to $30 range, which would be sort of a $25 to $30 discount to the in-market price for that service, above in a available to all scenario, would have a dramatic effect on the overall pricing in the industry. And I say that because that 4 gigabyte rate plan today is what I refer to as pretty much a reference plan. It's a reference value point in the market. Rogers pricing, Fido pricing, and Chatter pricing all are interconnected. The pricing is always everything is always connected to all other pricing in the market at every time. And so by offering changing the price point of that price point, it would hinge and ratchet on the pricing of all of the plans in the market across Canada. So in above the line in-market scenario, it would have a dramatic effect and get in the way of some of these, the balancing acts that we've talked about between financials and investments for the future, et cetera. With a strong eligibility criteria, as we've described earlier, and the right conversation on exactly how to fine-tune that value proposition within that range, I think there is an opportunity to offer something, with substantially more value for those customers in Canada in the most need.
What about, for example, a 2 gig plan? Same views?
The 2 gig plan clearly wouldn't be quite as, 4 gigs is right in the heart at $55 today. 2 gigs, though, I think is still at $45, in the $40 to $45 range. So it would have that similar effect, for sure. On Chatter right now, we have a $30 1 gigabyte plan, unlimited nationwide. That plan is an in-market plan. We see that plan satisfying, the basic needs of Canadians looking for some data, understanding how much Wi-Fi is consumed amongst our customer base when they're not on wireless connectivity. So, there's already that price point in place today. But getting north of into the 2 and the 4 gigabyte range starts to really hit at the center point of the Canadian market, where we look at an average usage in Canada of 2.5 to 3 gigabytes per sub. That becomes the very heart of the Canadian wireless market today.
But just bears repeating, but you did say with necessary, in your view, restrictions, then you're prepared to look at those types of arrangements.
If it's aimed specifically at groups of low-income Canadians or seniors with the right means testing, then I think it's a conversation we're willing to entertain and discuss how to best approach it. If it's a plan that's broadly available to everyone, it could be devastating overall. As Brent said, the average customer that we have uses about 2.5 gigabytes of data a month. And our average revenue per customer right now sits at around $54, $55. Our break-even point, I'm not going to repeat all the elements of our cost and how our cost basis are. Our break-even point sits in the 40s. So it stands to reason that if we introduce a plan that would impact 2/3 of our customer base, is our math in terms of how a 4 gigabyte plan would actually reflect itself in the market. It would eradicate, I would say, the vast majority of our profits. And more importantly, it would actually stop investment in totality. So by narrowing the size of the plan and aiming it at a specific group that is means tested, then I think that's a great conversation to have and something we can work on. But a broad plan at 4 gig would eviscerate the industry economics, given the cost structure and all the things we talked about around population density. As we continue to invest in the future, as we drive the unit cost economics to a better place, of course there'll be an opportunity to offer more data at a better affordable price point, just like we have over the last 5 years. But to do it in sort of one key moment would make the melt from overage on unlimited plans seem immaterial in comparison to what would happen here.
Thank you. I think I know the answer to the next question, but I will ask you for the record. Would you have a view on whether the Commission should mandate such a plan?
Mr. Chair, you're correct. I think I've answered that question.
Just touching back on the marketing or the way in which you communicate with consumers at your retail points of presence and so on. You said that the initial contact helps the sales agent or Rogers employee to determine needs and so on. If I were a customer just asking what my best low-cost option is? I don't know if you can answer that. What would you, where do you think your representative would begin? What kind of information would be provided? That's a bit general, I understand, but
I can give you like a directional answer, I think, to that broad question. Many Canadians view their wireless service as a solution, which includes both a service plan and a hardware solution. That solution very often has, and depends, the time of year, as Joe mentioned earlier, a promotional aspect to it. So there will be certain plans that are discounted and certain devices that are discounted. I would say that becomes a very important point of the conversation. Customer would ask you how much your data usage tends to be. Have you gone over on your old plan? Because we know we want people to feel comfortable that they're in the right data plan for them. And what kind of device do you really like to use? Are you a heavy smartphone user? Do you have an appetite towards Android or iOS? These all become very important factors. Are you a really engaged user, or are you an occasional user? For the occasional user, I'm just going to argue that we're going to probably suggest to you a mid-range iPhone, a mid-range Android device with a plan that has somewhere around the average gigabytes for Canadians, and you would give us hopefully a very specific answer around the type of user that you are. Probably in the sort of 2 to 4 gigabyte range would be the solution. Increasingly, customers are moving to used devices in Canada also. So we're seeing, and we're driving to create affordable solutions that allow people to get into a used phone that's certified by Rogers or fied out so they can get even more affordable outcome on the device side, because that allows them to get into a device that's more of a mid-range and perhaps a few generations old, but it's been previously used, but we've refurbished for them.
thank you. What about customers who may be more vulnerable due to their age, language barriers, and so on? How do you address those types of challenges?
Again, this is the beginning of a relationship in that conversation in the store. So there's every effort made to ensure that there's the right communication occurring. One of the more recent things we've done is on the Rogers brand is introduce a service called Pro on the Go. We're expanding that nationally. This is a service where a rep will actually come to your home and offer, you buy online or over the phone through a phone conversation, have that discovery discussion, but a rep will physically come to your home, often in the language of, because there are multiple language opportunities, to offer very tailored and unique assistance in the comfort of your home or in the local Starbucks around the corner. We've seen this appeal greatly to people with accessibility issues, people who find it difficult to get out to the mall, and we're quite excited about its opportunity to serve those customers which have difficulty, and also to expand our addressable market. That's been something we're rolling out as we speak. We're starting in Toronto, and we're rolling it out nationally.
Thank you. A little more of a focused question, having regard to the concerns raised about reasonableness of wireless prices, including those on behalf or by vulnerable customers. Can you comment on whether you believe it would be appropriate for the Commission to de-forbear from either or both of Section 25 and 27(1) on that basis, and only insofar as it's necessary to mandate a specific low-cost occasional use plan?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what actually you mandate. If you mandate something that's very specific, very targeted, with high eligibility requirements, then perhaps Section 24 might work. However, if you do something that's more broad, that would impact the market in the way that Joe and Brent were describing, that you set one price point and everything pivots around it, that would possibly lower the entire industry's prices, then I think that possibly forbearance would have to go through. Or deforbearance, excuse me. I don't, however, believe that the market conditions as they are right now would dictate deforbearance.
You mentioned how broad it might be and whether or not it would be suitable to impose a condition under Section 24 if it were to ensure that customer service representatives are properly trained, provide prominent links, for example, on websites and kiosks, and in the stores. Is that type of
I think that's probably
framework suitable to mandate under Section 24?
Yes, I think those kind of ideas would probably fall under Section 24, be more suitable, yes.
Thank you. Perhaps, and I'm nearing the end of my questions on retail, and we can take a short break, I think, before I do wholesale. Win-back. Talk about win-back for a moment. Are win-back tactics appropriate and fair for consumers?
Let me start that by saying customers switching is one of the primary means at which customers communicate with us as a carrier. And when customers switch, we have a variety of what we would refer to as retention activities. We certainly don't want to see them go. And so there's two instances. One is, of course, they call us and say, I'm thinking of switching. We will offer them a solution which we think better fits their needs and try to retain those customers. Or secondly, if they go to a store and they port out and port their number to another provider, we will call within 24 hours that customer with a similar conversation to try to retain their business with us. Yeah, and it's within the 24 hours, 24-hour period. Sometimes it takes us a little longer, depending on how quickly we're able to contact the customer. We see, Joe mentioned the vigorous promotional activity that occurs in the market. Prices are bouncing very, very often. And sometimes at the store level, there will be a one-day sale. Sometimes over the weekend, there will be a weekend sale. And carriers are different, moving prices at different times, and the prices are moving around the market constantly. So this again reflects the hesitate to use the word vigorous again, but vigorous competition for subscribers. And as was mentioned earlier, the 33% of net additions taken by the regional carriers in the market in 2019. So this is actually an opportunity for us to provide more choice and a solution to that customer that if they didn't provide that communication to us and we didn't respond, they would not have available to us. So to me, it enhances choice for consumers. It creates another basis of competition, and it keeps the promotional intensity sharp in the industry, because customers know, every participant knows that everybody is all trying to win back each other's customers when these things are in place. So it stimulates even more competitive dynamic around that. So I would say no, or the original question being, I would encourage win-backs to continue to be seen as a valid and customer-oriented promotional and business activity in the light that I described.
I think you were saying no for my next question,
Okay.
which would be, would you agree with a proposal, for example, that we've heard about restricting on a time-limited basis win-backs?
It's my view that would be anti-consumer. I think the only person, the consumers would be hurt in that situation, and I don't see a basis for making that decision.
Do you have proactive programs or proactive measures to ensure that your longtime customers have plans tailored to their needs? Do you reach out proactively to go get them to sign up, give them another plan, a better plan,
sure,
before an opportunity to leave you occurs?
Yeah, there's always the pricing that one sees on the website. There's the offerings, and then we have a large customer base, and we have tactics and promotions and treatments that we provide to our base on an ongoing basis that are tailored for their unique needs. And we'll always be looking to figure out how we can offer our customers things that make their experience better with us. Sometimes there's treatments where maybe our network was down in a particular area, and we want to apologize to that customer and ensure that they continue to be happy with our services, and we take action on that. Or we see them that they're on one of our older plans, and they've been bumping up against their data limits and are experiencing overages, which we don't think is such a great thing. And so we will reach out to them proactively and offer them an infinite plan, and try to get them onto a better place, and one that's more win-win. As I mentioned earlier, we try to be in long-term sustainable relationships with our customers. Customers can switch very easily in the Canadian market, 17% in a given year. It's a real fight every day to both attract and retain customers in the Canadian marketplace. So we need to be always on our front foot in terms of ensuring customers see us as having, good value with the right solution, and that increasingly, actually, that we're personalizing our experiences and our solutions to their unique needs. Given the state of play across, a broad other set of industries, that Canadians increasingly expect us to know more about them and how we can serve them more uniquely in a more personalized manner.
This will be my last question.
Just one quick comment on that. Sorry, Mr. Chair. We have a team that we call customer-based management. Brent's alluding to their activities and how they treat customers, et cetera. What they do every day is they have an ability to look into our customer base and say, which customers do we think have a propensity to churn? And they've created a model, if you will, that says, have we let that customer down recently because maybe the network was down, or they had a billing problem that we had to make an adjustment, or they tried to call us and they couldn't get through. They have a number of parameters that speak to how that customer might be thinking about leaving. And we will practically reach out to a list every single day to say, hello, we noticed that you bumped up against your overage plan. If we do this, would that resolve your problem, et cetera? So it's been a very effective approach for us, and it's actually helped to drive churn improvement by getting ahead of it before customers decide to leave. Sometimes we know the customer loves the latest phone. We'll call them well before they've paid off their phone balance, and we'll say, hey, the new iPhone is out. You've been a great customer of ours. Here's a special promotion on that new iPhone if you want to make the change right now. So this base management is sort of is a massive activity and a big investment that all the carriers have made that isn't as visible on the website or isn't as visible anywhere else, but it actually fuels affordability in the industry.
That's a great segue to my last question, but you understand, appreciate the view from consumers that they don't know what the real price is for that very reason, that it's not necessarily what's on the website, that there are a wide range of promotions, that the service providers are reaching out to some customers but not all customers and offering them what they might perceive as a sweetheart or special deal. So there's a great angst among consumers that they're not sure about the prices and the fairness of the prices.
Well, just having, when we see the results of these particular programs, which we're always evaluating, saying, is what we're doing making a difference? If we don't offer an above value plan, in other words, some solution that's more than what they could get by going onto the web, we don't get the results that we need on those campaigns. So I would say that, if anything, Canadians are becoming more and more aware of the various things and are highly aware of the various offerings. They're one click away from a website to look at what's available, or actually it's on the device that they're using every day. And so, and a lot of these communications aren't, they're not individual one-on-one conversations. They might be an MMS, like a text message that we send to the customer. They don't have to respond right away. So they have the opportunity to shop and compare. And I would just go back to, those offerings are always above what, and tuned in a way to get customers to a new place that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get on the website, because they're offering value given their unique circumstances and given our understanding and the relationship we have with them.
Thank you. Dave, Mr. Rott?
I was going to say, it's outside what we asked Mr. Feasy, Richard, to do for us, but from your experience around the world, do you have any insight into this particular type of issue, the posted price versus promotional and discounted pricing?
Well, I think in my experience, I mean, it's a standard feature of certainly all the wireless markets that I've seen, and I recognise, I think, the challenge to some extent that the chairman's characterising, which is the appearance that active and engaged customers appear to be able to get a better deal than customers who are less engaged, either because they're vulnerable, as we talked about earlier, so they have sort of identifiable reasons why they may struggle to engage with the market, or for other reasons which may be quite difficult in terms of them being able to identify them. And I think regulators around the world, in my experience, are wrestling with this problem, because the answer to it does not appear to be on the supply side of the market. It does not appear to be giving inactive customers more choices. It's on the demand side. It's finding ways in which customers who otherwise struggle can engage effectively with the choices that are available to them and the opportunities that are available to them. And certainly in my experience, the big insight, in a way, and the new insight that people are currently wrestling with is that the solution to these kinds of challenges is not on the supply side. It is trying to find ways on the demand side to help groups of customers engage better with the market.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll resume at 12:27. Thank you. Welcome back. Wholesale. Let's start, I guess, with first question, which put in the most general sense, one would expect, putting aside the mandating of MVNOs, that such arrangements would occur naturally in a market. And we've heard much about the various MVNO offers that have evolved in various markets. But we really haven't seen that in Canada. And I know, and we'll put aside MVNOs focused on IoT applications or B2B, which I know you have taken on or negotiated, I should say. Why not? I mean, really simple question. Why haven't MVNO arrangements been negotiated? Why haven't you negotiated MVNOs?
Well, first of all, we have negotiated MVNOs, but let me just start more broadly and I'll come back to that statement. As a carrier, as a provider, we look at market segments and areas of the market and say, should we address those directly or should we do it through a wholesale arrangement? And that's been happening since the very beginning of the telecommunications industry. As you well know, on the wireline part of the business in Canada and elsewhere, there's a fervent wholesale market. On the wireless market, we made a decision to buy Microcell and keep the Fido brand. We made a decision to launch the Chatter brand, These were ways of addressing a part of the market. We could have easily have said, you know what, we're not going to address the chatter segment of the market. We're going to do that through an MVNO wholesale relationship. And you basically make a trade-off in your mind. Do I want to open stores, open a call center, worry about marketing, building a brand, or do I just get economic rent from my network and let someone else worry about that? In Canada, the market has evolved such that we have multiple brands by carrier, not just the national carriers, but increasingly the regional carriers with the launch of Fizz in Quebec as well as the Videotron brand as a whole. So the market's evolved in that manner. Where there are areas of the market that we feel are being underserved or there's an opportunity, we're very open to the idea of MVNOs. We have an MVNO relationship with a company called Star. They are a provider of wireless services under the Petro-Canada brand, under the 7-Eleven brand. So that's a part of the market where we believe it's important to have presence, but we don't want to do it directly. We're happy to form that sort of relationship. We had a relationship with both Videotron and Eastlink in the early days of their foray into wireless, where essentially they were reselling the wireless network of Rogers to get going in the marketplace. And we felt both in Quebec and Atlantic Canada, it was the right economic trade-off between wholesale and retail for us as an organization. So we've been very open to those notions and those ideas. In areas where we may own spectrum that we're not using as much, or that we can't seem to get it above that list that George looks at with respect to investment, we're happy to subordinate that spectrum to, really it's a wholesale relationship, but it's really an infrastructure-based provider. And we've got dozens of these across the country that will address a market by wholesaling our spectrum, for lack of a better descriptor, by subordinating to them. So we're open to the ideas. I mean, I would maybe ask Dion, if you don't mind, Dion, just talk a bit about, Dion's our Director of Wholesale, about the proposals you do see from potential MVNO candidates, how you approach and address it. Just give the panel a view into that world.
Well, and a good start, just a starting point would be helpful in terms of just how do you, what is the starting point for negotiations to propose a set of terms and conditions? How do you go about it?
Thank you. We get approached by a number of prospects year over year. We have conversations with each one of them. We assess the proposal, the value proposition that they want to bring to market. And then at that point, if we believe there's a way forward and there's a larger conversation to be had, we sign an NDA with them. But only 50% make it to the NDA stage. Many of them drop off for the reasons we've mentioned earlier, going to the IoT market segment, because they're not quite clear on what exactly they want, so they come to me first. Some of them proceed with the discussions with our competitors and sign arrangements with them. And then many of them actually tend to, once we start to talk about what it's required, the scale and scope of running such a business, sometimes they end up speaking to our branded channels and go to the retail side because they're much more supported there, and the role that they play is at a smaller scale and scope, and they feel that that's something that they could be more successful with. So they approach us. If they make it to the NDA stage, like I said, about 50% of them do. Once we get past that stage, that's for the purposes of sharing more details, to understand more about how they want to go to market, what level of investment they have, what market or segment they want to target. We ask them for a business case. And when we get to that stage, then another about 70% of the 50% that remain drop off, because they just don't understand what's required to get into a business like this, and they tend to lose interest. And so that's kind of the process we follow. But certainly there's been a mass shift from a smartphone MVNO voice proposition to the machine-to-machine, as we mentioned, and I know you already said you're very well aware of that. But it's very difficult to find a niche market today that isn't already fully addressed by the many brands in the market today.
And most of the proposals, for lack of a better word, that come to you, do they tend to be sort of full MVNO proposals, or do they tend to be a rebranding type offering?
They are generally and mostly full. They don't have any infrastructure. They don't own spectrum. And they are looking for what they believe is an easier way into the market and quicker, but when they realize that just because you're not bringing the engineering or the spectrum to the table, there's still a very large endeavor behind that.
And what role, sorry, go ahead, Mr. Watt or Mr.
I was just going to clarify in terms of how full that we're talking about the same thing here. In terms, I think full is, in the context of the hearing, a full MVNO is where the MVNO provides a core network, own switching, billing, etc., as opposed to more what you might call a rebrander. And I think Deanne is going the other way there.
You're absolutely right, David, and I apologize for that. I always knew the full MVNOs being those where they fully MVNO the business case. I apologize for that.
I understood your response.
Okay, apologies for that.
Not at all. What role does spare capacity play in your consideration? Is that a determining factor, the amount of capacity available, spare capacity in your network?
Given the 30% per annum data growth rates that we have, spare capacity is being very quickly used up across our network. I mean, George spoke earlier to how we manage capacity. The forward capacity in our network is often measured in months. In some cases, depending on events or major activities, it can be measured in weeks. So George has a methodology that looks on as you mentioned, a 100 square meter basis and looks at capacity and is forever evolving it. It's not in our interest to have capacity lay fallow. Given our cost of capital, given the amount of debt that we take on as an organization, given the returns at 5.1%, it's not in our interest to have capital in the ground that's not earning revenue. So we tend to try to really synchronize as much as possible the addition of capacity with the ability to extract return from that capacity. The only thing that's sort of warehoused, for lack of a better word, often is spectrum, because we're waiting for spectrum to be cleared or be available or be deployed, but everything else is done as much as possible on a just-in-time basis for the reasons I described.
Thank you. Some parties in the proceeding have argued that wholesale MVNO access is not an essential service in the same way that wholesale roaming was found to be in 2015 177. I'm guessing that's your position as well?
Correct.
So what's the appropriate service or facility to apply the test to? Is it RAN access? Or is it MVNO access?
Sorry, I think it would probably more apply to the RAN, but I don't think the RAN would actually meet the test by itself. I think there are ways, excuse me, for people to get entry into the market. As we already discussed, the government has been setting aside spectrum, excuse me, consistently for over 10 years now. I think we've seen a lot of entry into the regional markets of Canada. I again see Ray's ExploreNet, who has the possibility to become an additional carrier in the network. And last but not least, I don't think there would be any substantial lessening competition even if someone didn't get access to these components. The market in Canada is clearly competitive. There are four facility-based carriers in each market with 7 or 8 brands. So I don't think it would meet the essentiality test in any event.
Thank you. We talked earlier, Mr. Watt, about appropriate geographic market with respect to retail. For wholesale. It was national for roaming, but some parties have argued for MVNO access it'd be provincial or smaller. Which of these positions do you hold?
I believe we would want the wholesale definition to match the retail definition.
Okay. We've also seen arguments that RAN's not essential because it's been duplicated by the regional carriers. But in areas where the regional carriers, in areas where regional carriers have duplicated the RAN, does that decrease the likelihood of further duplication? We talked about this a little bit this morning.
I think it does, because become the fifth carrier, they're starting up, they would have to acquire spectrum. Spectrum is not easy to acquire. A lot of spectrum is already in the hands of the existing 4 providers. Those 4 providers also need additional spectrum to grow. I think it would be difficult.
In your view, do national wireless carriers have market power in the upstream wholesale market for MVNO access?
Well, I believe there are 3 sources of acquiring the supply, and at the current time. Now, you might say that there's 4. It depends on the restrictions within the network sharing agreements as to whether there are 4 potential suppliers of the service to MVNOs. That is one of the ways you could possibly promote more competition in that sector by requiring the elimination of those requirements to get approval to the extent that they exist. By that I mean get approval from partner A if partner B wishes to offer an MVNO service to an MVNO. Potentially, some agreements have restrictions or require the approval of the other partner. And by eliminating those, you could increase the potential supply of that product.
Assume or agree with me for a moment that there is upstream market power. Would denying wholesale access to MVNOs substantially lessen or prevent retail competition in your view?
No.
In response to an RFI, you, and we appreciate the effort that was put into it, did put forward a proposed model for an MVNO access service. It contains, however, a number of conditions and qualifications. I'd like to talk about those for a second. In your model, you propose that eligibility be restricted to facilities-based cable carriers, ILECs, and small ILECs, but excludes CLECs. So can we start there? Why exclude CLECs?
Just that some CLECs don't actually have to put a lot of equipment themselves. It's just that some types of CLECs don't actually have to invest in any kind of significant amount of facilities. So we want to restrict it to those entities that actually have make the facilities investments that wouldn't preserve the incentive to invest.
Would that include facilities-based cable carriers who are also CLECs?
Well, at the time that we did the proposal, we suggested that. But in fact, since we've seen the proposal made by the Bureau, if you are going to mandate MVNOs, and we don't believe that you should, but if there was to be a mandated MVNO model, it should probably be more reflective of what the Competition Bureau suggested.
Okay, thank you. Again, with regard to small ILECs and CLECs, ILECs and cable facilities-based cable carriers, some of them are also operating as CLECs outside their incumbent serving territories. Would their eligibility be restricted to their incumbent territories, in your view?
It should be restricted to wherever they actually have footprint for delivering service using their own facilities. And if they're not making any significant investments, then they shouldn't. I'd also like to point out that when we made our suggestion, we had said that just investing in landline facilities is not sufficient. If they are going to do anything, they have to actually invest in wireless facilities, and that would have to be their ongoing obligation. Otherwise, they're just going to continue making the investments they otherwise would have, and there's really no teeth to this model. So in our view, you'd have to actually have mandated investment in wireless facilities.
Thank you for that. You also propose a restriction on the reselling of MVNO access. Can you elaborate on your reasons or why it's necessary?
It's just to keep control of who you're entering the business. It's to understand how much traffic will be on the network. Anybody, if there's a mandated regime out there, anybody can approach us directly. So it doesn't make sense in our view to actually have somebody who can resell. You need to keep some control over it.
But if you had the necessary, go ahead, Mr. Watt.
Well, I was just going to say, there's been some discussion earlier this week about cybersecurity issues of having resale, so that being able to actually track where the traffic is originating and how it is going, I think is another consideration when contemplating resale of resale.
But if the reseller reselling is subject to commission jurisdiction and the concerns about full information or cybersecurity concerns were removed, is it still remain a problem in principle? In other words, if we got rid of the practical concerns, are you still opposed to reselling?
Maybe, could I take an undertaking on that? Because, you know, I'm thinking back several years, there were certain clauses required of us, actually. So we were the carrier was held responsible for actions of certain reselling parties. I'd like to refresh my memory on that.
You are welcome to take an undertaking.
And make a proper answer.
Another condition is restricting it to the consumer market. Again, can I ask why prohibit MVNOs from selling to IoT business or enterprise customers?
Just because we ourselves have over 200 M2M IoT relationships out there. I think there's two distinct marketplaces between retail and business and enterprise, and clearly there is no shortage of MVNOs on the business side. I'm sure that other facilities-based carriers have similar customers on their network, so I don't understand why we would try to create a mandated regime for something that is so obviously well served.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I just take a second and explain these relationships now that we've talked about them? We do have about 200 different resale relationships in the IoT machine-to-machine world. They are everything from a service that enables your Kindle e-reader, a service that enables entertainment in your car if you subscribe to a particular service. It'll enable transportation and fleet management. We even have a service that will deal with pest control. So we are open for business as it relates to entrepreneurs and Canadian small businesses that show up at our doorstep and say, I've got a great idea for a machine-to-machine or IoT business or platform in a particular industry. We think it's part of our responsibility to actually enable these businesses. And I think in some ways it's a microcosm of what 5G is all about. 5G is all about creating these platforms that will go far beyond, e-readers and transportation management. They'll really go into enabling the business of the future and driving productivity in all sectors.
Thank you. In your response, you also included a condition that does not give MVNOs access to domestic or international roaming arrangements of the host carrier. Again, can you speak to why?
Again, those are relationships that we have spent a lot of time and effort building over the years. It is perfectly possible for any MVNOs to actually build those relationships. There actually are middlemen broker types out there that'll do them for them, and they can just go to one stop. So there is no requirement for them to take advantage of our roaming relationships. They are fully able to build their own, and I think the idea is to keep creating that incentive for these MVNOs to do as much as possible on their own and not rely upon us.
Okay, thank you. You've no doubt, if you've been monitoring the hearing, heard our questions about in relation to some concerns that have been raised about entry by large well-financed companies as MVNOs, for example, large North American tech firms. You've heard the questions. Do you share the concern? Can you tell me if you share it, and if so, why, and what kind of potential measures we could use, market caps, and so on, if appropriate?
I share the viewpoint that says large global web scale providers whose business value is measured, at $1 trillion or less, that have massive balance sheets, don't need any help or support coming into the country if that's what they chose to do. They have the financial wherewithal, they have the investment dollars to come and participate in this market and become an infrastructure-based player in this market and build networking capability that would support Canada and Canadians. So I feel the same way, that they just don't deserve a handout in any way, shape, or form. The market's been open to them from the very beginning, and they're welcome to participate, is the way I would describe it.
And as to measures, subscriber limits, market caps, any suggestions for us?
As an infrastructure-based player?
Measures to potentially limit their ability to avail themselves, pardon me, of an MVNO arrangement if mandated.
I don't think that. First of all, we don't believe that MVNO should be mandated, and it certainly shouldn't be made available to to a web scale provider. In terms of a test, I defer to my colleague to see if there's something we'd like to propose or whether we want to make it an undertaking, David.
I think we'd like to make it an undertaking because I think there are lots of complexities with any type of a cap or test in terms of trade considerations in a number of attributes. So can we take an undertaking?
That would be fine.
Thank you.
Another favorite subject of yours.
Just make one more comment, Mr. Chair, on this topic. I do think that it would be absolutely devastating to the quality and capability of networks in Canada to allow an MVNO of that scale or proportion as a whole. I do think it would just change the very nature and the future of the digital economy in Canada. They've got incredibly deep pockets. I mean, any one of them could just buy Rogers if a foreign restriction on ownership weren't there as a variable rounding error in their balance sheet. So I just don't understand any logic by which they would even be allowed to participate on any threshold.
Thank you. I do understand your position. Back to my next question, another favorite subject area, negotiated terms. What if there is to be a wholesale MVNO access arrangement, and if mandated, your view is that terms and conditions and rates should be left to commercial negotiations? So a couple of questions on that front. Putting aside the rate, which is not insignificant, in your view, would it be more efficient and less administratively burdened if the Commission were to endeavor to set out terms and conditions at the outset rather than in a tariff or decision, rather than leave it all to commercial negotiations?
We would prefer to leave it all to commercial negotiation.
And would the Commission's existing processes, its FOA process, be appropriate for resolving disputes between prospective MVNOs and Rogers?
We think that would be the fallback position. Yes, we think it really, the FOA should be conducted by a third-party arbitrator. Maybe that, and I understand this raises issues in your mind as to the delegation of authority, et cetera, but we do think that you could provide guidelines to that third-party arbitrator, and we would find that preferable to having the Commission act as the arbitrator. I just think it makes it more a stronger sort of commercial setting.
But whether it was the Commission or a third party, if everything is left to the negotiation process, including all the terms and conditions, is it likely? I can just envisage some very complex negotiations if parties are coming with starting from totally different starting points. Someone looking for a full MVNO versus a lighter version or rebranding version. Absent terms and conditions, how do you see all of that being resolved, in particular by a third-party arbitrator?
Well, as we say, we think it should be resolved in a commercial negotiation. We really think that's the essence of a properly functioning MVNO market, that people come with the propositions, they negotiate. Ultimately, the only way it can work is when it's a win-win for both, when both parties agree, and that can only be achieved when they're able to hammer out a meeting of the minds, and that really is what you should want. You should want all those matters to be sorted out by the parties. In fact, if they're not, I would suggest it's very unlikely it's going to be a very successful MVNO experience for anybody.
The record is clear that you don't support other approaches to establishing terms and conditions and rates for an MVNO if mandated, but I should give you an opportunity to put on the record your view for first retail minus approach to establishing a rate.
It won't be a surprise, but
few things are, Mr. Watt.
Yes, we're not in favor of a cost-based study to arrive at a rate, whether it be the traditional methodology of phase 2. I think we have clear evidence of the difficulty of that exercise earlier this year. In terms of retail minus, a problem that generally arises there is what is the definition of the services, and then how do you address promotions, discounts? If the product is provided 3 months free, is that the lowest retail price that you then discount from? There are these complexities. We have mused, and we know we're coming to a proceeding on a review of costing methodology. We muse and don't hold us to this when we make our submissions, but whether something such as an average retail sort of an ARPU for a service that would take into account the discounts and the promotions, et cetera, would be a better starting point than, say, the listed price. That it sort of ignores your problem of discounts and free months. And then arguably, it's simpler to identify the cost, the avoidable costs, than it is to do a bottom-up phase 2 and get into the complexities of the network, which is very difficult. So, but in general, we don't like any of those proposals. I might ask Richard to talk about the international experience on how some of these some rates have been set, or how are they set, if if that's all right, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the first point, I suppose, is that instances of regulators determining the price are so rare as I think to be almost non-existent. In the two cases that I referred to in my opening remarks in Europe where MVNO access had been regulated, the regulator was never asked. The firms were always able to come to a commercial conclusion with the MVNOs because in those cases, it's worth noting, the challenge that had been identified was that there was a lack of offers of MVNOs. There wasn't an allegation that the operators were coordinating on the terms, the commercial terms that were then supplied. So once the operators were obliged to supply, the commercial terms appeared to sort of take care of themselves. The problem, in my view, or the biggest problem, whether you're doing some kind of cost model or you're using a retail minus, but any sort of regulatory approach, is that you end up setting a single price for a very diverse set of demands. So typically in MVNO markets, their characteristic is the MVNOs differ amongst themselves in terms of the parts of the market they're seeking to serve, the niche, often niches, and the strategies that they're pursuing. And in a normal functioning competitive market, that would lead to different commercial prices for each of those MVNOs with their host operators reflecting the different value calculations for each in particular model. So, and the difficulty with using a regulated pricing approach, it's very hard for a regulator to set all those different pricing points that would mimic the way a properly functioning competitive market works. You will just set sort of one rate, and that rate will then apply to all the MVNOs who are seeking access. And it might be appropriate for some, if you can get there, but it won't be appropriate for others. So you're in a world where there will be permanent discontent amongst at least some of the players because the pricing is not reflecting the commercial situation. So I think the experience is that, and the consequence of that, recognizing that, is that typically regulators have adopted this approach of saying we look to the parties to find that a commercial price that you would expect to get in a properly functioning market. And we seek to avoid, and thus far successfully in the rest of the world, ourselves intervening in terms of substituting our own view of what the rate should be.
Thank you. Let's talk about the Bureau's model for a second. Let's set aside their conclusions with respect to the competitiveness of the retail market, which I understand you do not agree with. Otherwise, what's your view of their model?
I know this sounds repetitive, but I need to say it. We are against the notion of mandated MVNO and access in the market. On the surface, when you look at the Competition Bureau proposal, it's the most similar to an infrastructure-based, investment-oriented regulatory approach that we've seen or that has been, postulated, but it may on the surface seem like the least harmful, if I can call it that, with respect to investment, et cetera. But when you dig into the details, you realize it's very complex, extremely complex, and it really, pivots on this notion of the 5-year sunset. And we've debated amongst ourselves, we just can't seem to figure out how we could actually effectively manage a 5-year sunset if we have given responsibility for it. Frankly, I think it does undermine the regional carriers and the investments that they've made and the success that they're having in the market. And it just punts the problem into the future with respect to managing that sunset. I don't know what would happen in year 4, for example, when there are, customers being served by that provider, yet they have not met their obligations with respect to building, And then we're into this very difficult circumstance that will probably start with a plea to extend the period longer, and we will, really never effectively be managing to that complexity is the worry. So, I mean, I'll pause there and let others comment if they want to, but we think it's problematic.
You mentioned the sunset, and I appreciate you've made clear that you don't support the approach. If it were to be implemented, is your view, would it be from the day of a decision, or would it be tied to when a competitor buys spectrum in a market?
We do think it would be from the day of the decision.
Would it be
in terms of?
Pardon me.
Excuse me. I was thinking of the second part. When there's a spectrum auction, probably either later this year or early next year, should a new player acquire spectrum, I think it would start for that player at the time of the spectrum acquisition. I don't think that's all that administratively complex, because I don't think you're going to have really large numbers of players, new players, buying spectrum. So I don't think, at least in that perspective, from the start date, that their proposal is overly complex.
If we did adopt the Bureau's model, would it be appropriate to restrict MVNO access to regional carriers with a minimum investment, spectrum deployment, or number of subscribers in order to ensure continued investment?
I think it's fair to say we just don't support the proposal as a whole, and it just, in its complexity, it feels like we're trying to land a very big airplane on a very small aircraft carrier to try to find a solution that might work with all these complexities wrapped around it. So it's very difficult to comment on a specific element of it when we just think the model just doesn't make sense in totality, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe one comment we would make, though, we really do not understand the possibility of having a fine levied on people who availed themselves of the opportunity and went into an area where they had previously been and actually sold and then started to deploy and then found, well, it just doesn't make sense. I think, quite frankly, they've been punished quite enough having that investment and or having had customers come to them and then being told that, well, no, we're not going to actually provide service in that area anymore. I really don't see how that aspect of the proposal plays.
And what do you think of the notion of, call it a Bureau Plus approach, where access on an MVNO basis might be permitted for the regional players outside of their serving territories?
I think, for the reasons that Howard mentioned earlier, we would be opposed to that. We believe it should be closely tied to facilities-based investment and facilities-based provision as possible in the wireless spectrum field.
Thank you. In your submissions, you've stated that if the Commission mandates the provision of wholesale MVNO access, it should be limited to a period of 5 years. Can you clarify what you're thinking? You just mentioned some of the concerns about the Bureau's proposal to sunset after 5 years. Are they not similarly true for an MVNO arrangement?
Yes, they are. This was in our, I'll reiterate what Joe has reiterated, that we're opposed to MVNO. So this was in a spirit of, in the alternative, should that be the case, how would you in our view, limit the damage, and in our view, you would limit the damage by a sunset clause, despite our reservations that the sunset clause would not ultimately be adhered to. But we
is the, if you look at other carriers, again, if the Commission were to mandate MVNOs, should regional carriers be mandated? And you can guess the follow-on question, SaskTel specifically, or T-Baytel?
Well, if you were going down that path, I think you probably would have to with respect to SaskTel and T-Baytel. They are the large provider in those territories. With respect to the three newer regionals, I would think you possibly could not place the obligation on them. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think that it resolves the concern. If you're thinking that if they are not mandated to provide the access, that lightens the issue for them. I don't think so, because they still will be facing an MVNO who will be riding on the larger players' networks and competing against them in the retail market. I know T-Baytel said they actually wanted, should you go down this course, that they would have, an MVNO would have to come to them first. And again, their presumption there is that the rate that would be struck by whatever means would be fully compensatory. They might live to regret that decision, that it comes to them first if the rate were to be struck below the cost. But I think that would be our answer. T-Baytel and SaskTel as the largest players in those markets, and don't think you should have to mandate on the three new players.
Thank you. I know you don't, all of this is assuming something to which you've stated your opposition, but have a couple of more points in this area. Should the requirement to provide MVNO access only apply to the wireless carrier in each area with the largest network coverage area or market share?
As you can tell, this is one we really haven't thought of before. Can I take an undertaking?
You may, and why don't I give you two other sub-points, and maybe you can address them all together. So maybe it would bear repeating, should the requirement to provide MVNO access only apply to the wireless carrier in each area with the largest network coverage area or market share? And perhaps we can add, you might want to comment on the benefits of requiring the provision of a wholesale MVNO service over multiple networks covering a given area, and what would be the implications if we were to mandate only a subset of the national carriers to provide MVNO access, and if a subset were appropriate, to whom would it apply? So if you'd care to respond to those in an undertaking, that would be fine.
We will. I think Richard wants to respond from the international perspective now, since we have him here.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I mean, just a quick comment about how I think in other contexts people would think about this is the scope of your intervention depends on the problem that you've identified. So if the problem you've identified is that one carrier somehow has market power and is distorting the functioning of the market, then you would focus on the problem, on that carrier. My understanding is those people who are advocating intervention in this proceeding, I'm not aware that anybody is suggesting that a single carrier in and of itself has market power. As I understand it, the suggestion is that collectively some group of carriers. So at least the starting point for thinking about that question in other contexts would be that the scope of the intervention would depend on the way you characterize the problem.
Thank you. In your view, does the current definition of roaming in your roaming tariff apply to 5G?
No, the current wording in the roaming tariff does not cover 5G.
And what would need to be changed if it was to apply to
You'd
5G?
have to redo the roaming tariff.
And the supporting rates?
And the supporting right to roaming?
Would it require re-examination of the rates, of the, of the costs, not rates?
Possibly, yeah. Oh, sorry.
I'll make it a more definitive yes.
I thought you might. Would such a change have an impact on 5G rollout?
So the question is, if roaming were required on a 5G network, if the rates were redone to reflect the cost, I'm going to say likely not. To put it in perspective, roaming, and there's been a lot of talk about roaming. You have the numbers. You know the relatively small quantum of roaming, the dollar amount. It's I'm not going to say it's de minimis, but you're looking at, say, in the 1 to 2% range of the costs of people, so that is not that change in and of itself is not going to make or break a new player. Now, in terms of, I think for us, an absolutely new product that we're rolling out, when they have exactly the same opportunity to roll it out, I don't think it would be appropriate to require us to have to give access to 5G. It's again assuming that we have some type of advantage on something that hasn't even. We're just in the very early stages of rolling something out, and to be ordered to give access to it just doesn't seem to be the right way to go about it.
I would add, it would only serve to slow the progression of 5G. If anything, those who can avail themselves of set-aside spectrum at a lower cost have a bit of an advantage when it relates to 5G. So I think look at it from the perspective of 5G's early days. Let's push as hard as we can to extend it as far as we can into Canada before potentially impeding it.
Thank you. Just sticking with the roaming tariff for a moment, would any changes be required to limit the scope of mandated 5G roaming to services connecting to individual consumers versus like IoT devices? Would that would that kind of change also be required? Using the current roaming tariff as a starting point.
Again, I think this is what I'd like an undertaking for. If I could, I'm even just listening to the question, I was having trouble.
That may be the responsibility of the questioner, but
no, the question was fine. It just
you can see it on the transcript, and I'll accept the undertaking and not let you embarrass me.
No, the question was clear. My brain just couldn't connect the two pieces to think of an answer.
I'm kidding. And a question we have asked a number of parties, which really is two parts. We've asked whether your current network supports VoLTE, but I think the most important consideration is, are you on schedule for the 31st December 2020 date mandated by the Commission for 911 real-time text?
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Seamless roaming. You have identified, you've no doubt again heard the discussion on the record, you've identified that there are a number of changes required, billing systems, in effect having two networks interoperate seamlessly. Others have presented us with a different picture, suggesting that the costs are less and complexity is less than it's been suggested. So, for the record, could you give us your views? And I guess more important, and I'm sure this will be via undertaking, could you give us an estimate of what it would actually cost to implement seamless roaming? And that will, as I said, I will assume you want to respond to that one via undertaking.
Mr. Chairman, the implementation of seamless roaming is not only incredibly complex and costly to implement, but so complex to maintain that it becomes effectively useless. Let me qualify this statement. We have around 135,000 cells on our network. To provide seamless roaming, we would have to map each and every one of these in terms of the neighbor relationships between these cells and the cell of the roaming or the handover network. And not only would this be incredibly costly, as you can imagine, I mean, it's costly as it is for our own network because, we have to provide this mapping and relationship between the cells on our network, but we would now have to align the ongoing management and optimization with the other network as well. And so even if such an endeavor were to be done, every time there was a change in power on the network because of an increase in demand, or there was a change on a tilt of an antenna, or a change on a fault, that work would have to be redone again. I can also state from personal experience in the UK, where we had to apply this solution between two networks, one in the east of the country, the other on the west of the country, that even with the ongoing effort in what is arguably a much simpler solution because it's along a well-defined boundary, even there we were never really able to successfully implement it, and so the drop calls continue to happen. I would end by saying that even so, a seamless handover is only something that truly only really applies to voice. It's not a problem for data.
Out of curiosity, how long did it take to implement that solution in the UK?
It's still ongoing, to be honest.
But the initial attempt to implement.
It takes, there are a few things. One, it takes months, and the other one, it has to be done within a part of the, you have to essentially separate your engineering teams because this information of both networks is competitively sensitive information. So if you can imagine a network that is building a new site would have to provide information of this new site to the competitor to inform that this change would have to be done. And so in the case in the UK, we had well-defined Chinese walls between engineering teams that were part of this partnership and the ones that were not part of this partnership. And so this was an operation that took, essentially months and months. But as I said, it's an ongoing effort because I think, as Richard would attest, if he uses the M4, I'm sure he still has the same drop calls that we've tried to solve for many, many, many years.
recognizing or taking into account what you've just said, would you undertake to give us a best efforts response at what would be the cost and timeframes involved in
Yes, we will.
facilitating it with the usual underlying calculations and assumptions? Change of subject, and I'm getting near the end. You'll be glad to hear. You've heard from some parties, for example, Railway Association of Canada last week, and other public utilities who are seeking mandated access for enterprise and public entities. Your view is, I take it, that such access isn't required because there are commercial solutions. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's the case. We've actually had discussions with several of the utilities and railroads. We've already started to explore possible solutions for their issues. I think that we are, as a wireless carrier, the wireless connection expert. They have clearly special issues, including security, that they need to have addressed. And I think what will happen is that we'll work together to provide a solution that, whether it's private or semi-private or something will happen. I think you've already seen around the world with utilities or port installations or what have you. These kind of partnerships already develop, and I think that they will develop in Canada as well.
Thank you for that. Do you object to their proposal to obtain mobile network codes?
I think as long as it becomes part of a commercial arrangement, then we can figure out how best to do it, and if that's the best way, then we could consider it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, just one comment on this topic. In the world of 5G, one of the capabilities that we're working on is this notion of network slicing. And as you know, network slicing will allow us to deliver a portion of our network to a particular customer application that has very specific characteristics that meet their needs, whether it's latency, whether it's connection time, whatever that might be for that railroad or mining operation or utility, and actually save them the cost and effort of having to do something themselves, where the expertise is becoming more complicated and more individualized. We think that one of the great promises of 5G, besides speed and latency, is mobile edge computing and network slicing. We haven't talked much about these things, but I think they're topics that are worth considering as you opine on the future of the industry.
Thank you. Some of those same parties have also raised the use of eSIMs. Do you support the use of eSIMs in your devices in your network today?
We do.
You do? And would a device, see how to put this, would a device on your network be permitted to have another network profile on its eSIM at the same time as yours?
Not at the same time. The device would be attached to one network at a time, if that's your question. Now, the device could detach from one network and then attach to another network. You're able to do that today on any iPad, where you can select another network and attach to that network through the eSIM capability.
But not multiple ones at the same time?
Not at the same time.
Thank you. And is that true for machine-to-machine devices as well? The same availability rather, of eSIMs and those same characteristics?
Those devices, when they do need alternative connectivity, they tend to resort to roaming to provide the alternative connectivity.
Thank you. You've already answered my questions about network sharing, I think, when we talked earlier on the retail side. So my last area of questions, just a couple of final ones, and that goes to support structures. So you're unique among national carriers in that you don't have the same support structure assets that Bell and TELUS do, since you started off as a cable operator, not as an ILEC. So in that sense, you've probably got more in common with the regional competitors than with at least Bell and TELUS. Something that we've heard from both sides on this issue is that we don't seem to have a lot of hard data, and there's a lot of missing facts with respect to the magnitude of the problems faced and the resulting impacts. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, anecdotal descriptions, not so much in the way of hard evidence. Is there anything that you can provide now or through an undertaking that, for lack of a better term, a little harder data that can give us some information on frequency of denials, length of delays, financial impacts on your business?
We heard that question being asked the other day, and we got the wheels in motion to begin looking at a more fact-based approach that we could provide to you in an undertaking. We have many, many anecdotal stories. They are legion. The problems are real. They span from anything from the permit application process, where we're paying for inspections, we're effectively doing an audit for the ILECs, and when we finally complete that process and get given the bill, we're told that they don't actually have spare capacity for us, and some occasions they end up using that very same capacity that they claim is not available for us. That's one anecdote. When we do get denials, we're never really told, is it because we're using the capacity, or is it because we're saving that capacity for future use? So the rules under the tariff are very different than they are under the ISED protocol that we have for tower siting. That process is far more transparent. There are requirements if you are going to reserve capacity to provide that reservation to the requesting licensee. You have to provide drawings as to what the loads look like on the tower. And if you do reserve for, say, 18 months imminent future use and space does become available in the interim, you then have to go back to that requesting licensee and you let them know that they can get on now. We have none of that when it comes to the ILECs. So what we're doing is we are doing, for your purposes, a more extensive audit of the problems that we're facing. We're very hopeful that that can then feed into a tariff review process where these things would be fully aired, and we would end up with a tariff that would be far more transparent and where we would have much more, again, transparency in this process.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I were to add just a quick comment, there are three things that will impede the progress and evolution of 5G for the benefit of Canadians. One, we've talked about investment support in terms of regulation. Number two is access to spectrum, access to 5G spectrum in all its frequencies. And number three is this issue, access to support structures. We are woefully underprivileged in this area, and we need your help and support so that Rogers can fulfill the commitment to deliver 5G to Canadians.
Thank you. To the extent that you can provide, as I said, some more specifics by the deadline date of 10th March, that would be appreciated. Beyond that, and you just made reference to this, you propose that we hold a follow-up proceeding to look at the tariffs. But late last year, we did launch a proceeding looking at barriers to infrastructure deployment in rural areas. In your view, could the issues that you've raised about support structure access be addressed in that proceeding, or are you still in favor of a separate proceeding to specifically address these tariffs?
I think we'll still need a proceeding to separately address these problems because we're talking about sort of the tariff it sets out the rules of engagement between, say, Rogers and Bell, Rogers and TELUS in terms of our actual access. It's very detailed. And I think we can raise these issues in that proceeding. We will raise these issues. But I think more specifically, we're going to need to actually amend the tariff.
You've given us an indication of the kinds of issues you want. Perhaps in that undertaking, you could give us a more complete list of the issues that you would propose to see examined in that follow-on proceeding?
We'd be happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question from me, and then I'll ask my colleagues. You've also heard our discussions that we've had with numerous parties about the desirability of establishing a 5G working group. For example, as proposed by the FCM and some others. You've said some other things should come first, for example, some clarity around jurisdictional arrangements, but are there any lessons that we can take from your prior experience in other working groups, CISC or otherwise, that would make a 5G working group effective?
I mean, I think the problem is if we go back to the model MAA process, which I think was one of the working groups that was referenced in this context, that process took a year and a half. The parties could not come to consensus on many of the major issues, most of which revolved around, what are causal costs, what gets reimbursed, what doesn't, and so that process then took another year and a half to get a decision. So I think the lesson learned there is that this process probably won't work, that we really do need the Commission to clarify the rules of engagement. We have proposed that, frankly, out of this proceeding you can do that. The record is rich in terms of discussion around these issues. You asked questions in your RFIs that specifically addressed what was in the bounds of your jurisdiction. We responded, so did many other parties. It's a legal issue. It's a legal interpretation. There really, in our mind, is no policy reason that would cause you to treat wireless and wireline equipment differently. Now, with the onset of 5G, the time is nigh. If we have to wait for a working group, which we think would just get bogged down in issues of non-consensus, especially around things like occupancy fees. I mean, we, as you know, we don't agree that we should have to pay occupancy fees to place small cells on municipal street furniture, but we have, in our negotiations to date with municipalities, because we don't have the Commission's framework that we're looking for, we do end up paying occupancy fees to municipalities to place our small cells on traffic standards, light standards. That's something that is totally contrary to the LEDCOR principles, but because we don't have the framework and we need the access, we need to go ahead. And so we're currently signing those kinds of agreements, but we don't think it's right. And if we had your oversight and we had this clarification, then we would be well on our way to resolving that problem. We're quite prepared to pay for causal costs, as we do with access to rights-of-way. And we think that that same rule should extend to wireless equipment and to street furniture, and we've detailed that in our RFIs to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are all my questions. Commissioner Barron.
Thank you. I have a question for you regarding the example of the Quebec market. This morning, you spoke about the fact that Quebec has lower prices for wireless services. And I want to understand your position with regards to competition from regional facilities-based carriers in other markets. So when you say that the Canadian market is currently competitive, are you saying that regional competitors in other markets are already providing effective competition and that this will drive prices down potentially if we're patient? Or are you saying that the Quebec market is an outlier or different in some fundamental way?
We're saying both. First of all, we're saying that the regional carriers are doing a good job of driving competitive intensity in the markets. Look no further than last year. Last year, between Videotron and Freedom and Eastlink, they garnered 33% of the net new customers in the first 3 quarters of the year. That's more than Rogers got. That's more than TELUS got. And to Richard's commentary earlier, that is probably the most visible demonstration of success in a market, that new customers coming to market, they're getting that proportion of. When you compare that to the size of their base, it's even more stark. given that they have, a far smaller base of customers than we have as a whole. As it relates to the Quebec market, it's as intensely competitive as the other markets. Even before the arrival of Videotron, prices were lower in Quebec because the appetite, for whatever reason, was lower in Quebec. And today, even though prices are lower in Quebec, the percentage of Quebecers that have a cell phone is also amongst the lowest in the country. It's just the nature of the market and the structure of the market. Brent talked about Alberta, where in Alberta ARPU is the highest, and actually penetration is amongst the highest in the country. So these are vagaries of the Canadian market as they differ from region to region. But I would say to you that and you look at the fact that wireless prices have gone down by 50% in the last 5 years. You look at the percentage of net new customers garnered by the regional carriers. You look at what's happened this last year alone with respect to unlimited plans. The market is working, and the market is driving affordability, while at the same time supporting investment.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Pardon me, Commissioner Levy.
Good morning, good afternoon now. Just a couple of questions. We've seen different assessments of the Canadian market, and you're in the forecasting business. You do it all the time. What do you see as the capacity, the expansion in capacity of the growth in the numbers of consumers in the Canadian market over the next few years?
Sure. Well, as you said earlier, if you look at the number of Canadians over the age of 10, by the math alone, it's roughly equal to complete penetration as a whole. Having said that, a couple of factors do play in. Our models and forecasts look at the benefit of immigration to Canada, roughly about a 2% growth in the population. And we're seeing that in terms of the growth in wireless subscribers in the marketplace as a whole. We're also seeing growth in penetration, in the remaining portions of penetration, fueled by a few factors that are more novel to Canada right now and have been fully articulated in the U.S., for example. The idea of having two phones is not as prominent in Canada. In the U.S., it's actually quite prominent. The idea of separating your personal life from your work life and having a work device and a personal device is starting to take root in Canada. We're seeing some of that. So that creates a penetration gain and opportunity as well. The opportunity for people to add a tablet or other device to their plan, counts as a degree of penetration, albeit a different type of penetration, but still a rich appetite and use for the technology as a whole. So we think between immigration growth, the use of dual devices, thirdly, the fact that the used phone market, as Brent has called it, will actually create even more opportunity in terms of affordability. And we're seeing people give a used phone to, the older person in their family that may not have a phone yet, or a child that wants a phone for whatever reason, for security, safety reasons, or entertainment reasons. So we're seeing the proliferation of used phones actually expand the market as well. Penetration rates in Canada are roughly about 85–87%, and we see them marching towards 100% over the fullness of time based on these factors.
Just going to pick up on the last point that Joe mentioned. We do recognize a lower penetration in the the lowest income quintile, and so there's opportunity there to drive more penetration in what Joe has described as a pretty saturated market, and that's going to come from things like the used phone, some of the plans we're introducing, and quite frankly the potential plan that we were discussing earlier today. But there clearly is opportunity to drive more penetration in that area.
What about the your forecast for Canadians' data usage? Do you have anything that you can add to your previous comments on that?
Sure. I mean, right now we're seeing about a 30% growth in data usage. We do look to other markets to see, you know, if you will, where the puck is going. We talked earlier about South Korea. South Korea probably leads the world in many ways, along with Japan in terms of overall consumption. Their data consumption sits in the 20s, 25 gigabytes per month. On 5G. They've got a very ubiquitous 5G network. Before they launched 5G in Korea, the average consumption was sitting closer to 7 or 8 gigabytes. So there really is no reason why we won't be on that progression path. It's almost a bit of a view into the future. And we spend time with our peers in different countries to understand, you know, how they're seeing data consumption. So data consumption, we believe, will, you know, march from 2.5 to 3 gig to eventually 7 or 8 and beyond in the next many years.
You mentioned that that 5.1% return on assets, and you suggest that that's a better way of looking at your profitability, if you like. How do you think that compares to your major competitors?
Bell and Telus are both roughly in the same range.
Okay. And finally, transparency has arisen several times in various parts of the conversation this morning and this afternoon. You talked about the relationship with your customers and the kinds of deals that you're prepared to offer them. We heard one of the interveners earlier in this process suggest that Canada is still such a small market that you can't get Apple, for instance, to give you a bulk discount on devices for Canada. Is that your experience?
I defer to Brent, who's the former leader of Apple Canada.
Be careful what I say here. So, you know, I would say in the global context, Canada is relatively small, you know, from an Apple perspective, in the single digits in terms of percentage of their business, but it is large enough, fully, for sure, to be engaging with carriers to offer, you know, various incentives, and we work together to perform well in the market together. I'll just leave it at that.
I think one comment I'd make, which is more broadly, not specific to Apple, but if you add up the revenue of Rogers, Bell, and Telus, and then add to it Videotron, Shaw, and Eastlink as a total in wireless, we are no more than 2 to 3% of the total global revenue of the wireless industry across every country. So we sometimes have a hard time punching above our weight. We sometimes have to really work hard to understand what the very large players are doing, the Vodafones, the Verizons, the SK-Tels of the world, because they actually make the market and drive the technology direction. We often find ourselves drafting in their wake and making sure that we avail ourselves of some of the ideas that are out there. And we all do it. All the players do it. The industry does it. It's part of being in Canada and being small on a global scale.
So are you prepared to make any kinds of discounts and so forth readily apparent to your customers when you're negotiating with them? You know, if I have come to the end of my plan and I'm trying to decide, am I going to have more muscle in the market as I come to my new plan if I bring my own device, if I buy it myself? But if you can get it for me at a discount and over the course of a term, it will be less. Can you break that out for a customer so that they can make those kinds of decisions?
You know, I'd say a couple things. One, we've moved now across all of our brands that provide devices to a financing world where the service, the cost of service and the cost of the phone are delineated and very, very transparently separated. So people know exactly what they're paying for the phone, and they know exactly what they're paying for the service. And then at the end of the contract, when you're done paying for the payment for the device falls off, and you're left with just paying for the rate plan. So I think that takes us a giant leap forward versus a day when subsidy was, so in some ways, the rate and the hardware repayment were baked into the same cake, and it was hard to disaggregate sometimes which was which. So that's been a major step forward, I would say, first of all. Second, when you look at a customer and you're deciding at the end of their contract what type of promotion or what type of offer you might want to provide to them, I'd say two things. One, Joe mentioned that at the that a vast majority of our volume, a large proportion of the volume that happens in the market, happens at these peak moments: Black Friday, Boxing Week, and back to school. When you dig into that volume, you'll find that the majority of that is actually renewal activity. Those are people that are coming back to you and re-signing a contract and extending their relationship. And those happen disproportionately as well in those sale moments. So that's when customers are getting a deal. And those deals are very much set across the entire industry, given the level of competition, so that everybody's offering deals at the same time. And then in the case where perhaps we're talking to a customer one-on-one, given financing and given the opportunity to also understand that customer's unique needs and their loyalty to us over time and how long they've been a customer and the quality of that relationship, we will reward that and offer specific promotions and incentives to continue to be a customer with us. And those are very clearly laid out. And of course, we want them to say yes to that, so we'll always be referencing the in-market price at the time and the discount that's being offered. So that would be the nature of those interactions.
Thank you.
If you look at our desire and our number one priority as a company is to put customers first, right in that language and that manifest to the Rogers team is to be clear and simple with our customers. So it's part of our wiring to focus on all these areas where we can improve clarity.
Commissioner Levy, if I could just very quickly, I very confidently said that Bell and Telus' return on assets was similar to Rogers' 5.1. I said that on the basis of having looked at that number for 2018. It's dawned on me the 5.1 number we provided in order to take out gyrations or any jumps up and down in 1 year is a 5-year average. Can I undertake to do the precise same 5-year average for Bell and Telus just to make absolutely certain that what I said, that it's very comparable, is true? I don't want to mislead you.
Thank you. Sorry I interrupted you, Mr. Natali. Commissioner Leisner.
Good afternoon. You've argued that the current definition of roaming in your tariff does not include 5G. There are other parties that have argued, based on the way the roaming service is defined in the tariffs, that is, incidental access to GSM-based voice, text, and data services, that 5G would automatically be included unless the definition were to be changed. And I understand that that is the kind of wording that you use in Rogers Access Services tariffs. So how do you respond to that argument?
I just think that 5G is a big revolutionary step from the current existing technology. I'm not sure that the current tariff has phrase that was specifically directed at GSM-type technologies covers 5G. So I do think that some changes would be needed to reflect that change.
Okay. I had another question on spectrum. You mentioned that you have subordinated spectrum to a number of other providers. Would you undertake to provide us with a list of the specific spectrum and providers?
Yes, we will.
Okay. And then my last couple of questions. We heard yesterday from the Coalition for Cheaper Wireless Service that and specifically I'm thinking of the representative from Acorn, that a 1 gig plan just doesn't meet needs. I think she gave the example of currently there's a lot of disruption in the educational system in Ontario, and the only way she gets her information about whether the schools are being closed for her children is through data. You've indicated that you have a 1 gigabyte plan, which you feel is very reasonably priced. I think you mentioned around $27. So what's the overage charge on that plan?
The one I mentioned was a chat or prepaid plan for $30. That, by its definition, doesn't have overage. So prepaid, you pay in advance, and then when you use up your allotment, then you're prompted to pay more if you'd like to continue to use it. It allows you to very efficiently begin end-to-end service. Really appeals to people who don't always know that they're able to continue on with service also. So that's it's sort of inherent to that plan that it doesn't have overage.
Broadly speaking, the biggest consumer of data is video. If you were to see a pie chart or a sort of an unpacking of how data gets consumed, video, and especially high definition video, is the biggest consumptive factor. And it's happening in all media that people are watching more and more video for entertainment or information or other purposes. And that's the challenge that we face in trying to structure these plans, at the same time build a network that can transmit and broadcast more and more video over time.
Although, I mean, we have seen that 2 gigabyte plans are available in Quebec for $35 amongst virtually all the providers. It just seems to be that outside that province, consumers are out of luck at that price point.
As we said before, there are variations in plans across the country. As opportunities come along, we will look to create more value in low-end plans. We hear the comments of Canadians loudly and clearly. As the economics of the business improve and evolve, much like when we went from 250 meg to 500 meg to a gig at roughly that price point, we'll continue to see more at low-end price points over time.
Okay, thank you.
I believe Commission Counsel has a short snapper. Hint.
Given the time, I'll endeavor to make this short. I just want to make it perfectly clear, to get your position on the matter perfectly clear. When you were discussing the issue of the current roaming tariff and 5G, is your position that the current tariff ought not cover 5G because changes should be made to the tariff, or that it technically does not apply to 5G?
Technically, it does not. It does not contemplate 5G.
Okay. Last question.
Sorry. Just yeah, no, that's right. That's fine. Sorry.
So how the terms are defined in the tariff do not.
The tariffs as currently written do not cover 5G.
Okay. So then your position on that would be that Videotron's interpretation of the tariff language is incorrect.
Exactly.
Last area that I want to ask a question on has to do with the discussion that was going on earlier about the mechanism for establishing rates, terms, and conditions in a hypothetical environment where there was mandated MVNO. And I believe, Mr. Watt, you were saying that in that hypothetical environment, it should be left to negotiations, backstopped by some third-party arbitration process, which would see, to the best as I understood it, no commission involvement. Now, I believe you spoke a little bit to the question of delegation and why you thought this would not constitute impermissible delegation, but I just want you to expand a little bit on that.
I will have to turn to one of my lawyers to expand on the delegation authority. I'm not sure if we're prepared to speak to that today or give you an undertaking on that. I know it was an issue that you raised with other parties. We've addressed it. We're still coming to a conclusion on it. Not sure if that's helpful or not.
If you'd like to take that away as an undertaking,
we will.
That'd be fine. Thank you. And that's all. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just clarify? Because before you asked whether it was technically cover 5G or ought to cover 5G. So technically, I don't think it covers 5G. And why I got a little confused there is our position is very clear that it should not include 5G. If there is a mandated MVNO regime, 5G should not be part of the regime. So I just want to make sure that position is quite clear. Thank you.
That concludes the presentation from Rogers. Mr. Natale.
Mr. Chairperson, thank you for the time and the considered thoughtful questions and commentary. Appreciate the opportunity to state our views and thoughts. Before we go, I think it would be remiss to not recognize a particular individual. It was 38 years ago this year that a young David Watt first sat at a CRTC hearing, and this year we will celebrate the contribution of Mr. Watt to the Rogers organization as we celebrate his retirement and he takes the next chapter forward. I would ask for the record to recognize Mr. Watt.
Thank you for that. I wasn't sure that Mr. Watt would ever actually retire.
We tried to convince him otherwise. We were unsuccessful.
And I'm not entirely persuaded that that's the case. We may leave a seat somewhere in the back with a nameplate on it in the event that he just starts to hang out at future proceedings. But I too would like to acknowledge Mr. Watt. He has always been a collegial and responsive participant in our proceedings. Pardon me. See, I am getting choked up now. In our proceedings, and has no doubt made significant contributions to the building a public record on many proceedings over many years. Mr. Watt, I wish you well in your retirement.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind words, and it has been a great honor for me to appear before the Commission.
Thank you. We will adjourn, returning at 3 o'clock. Thank you.